Randy and Amber's divorce was a scandal. According to the ex-spouse, their marriage was a mistake. It all started when a successful businesswoman, owner of 2 restaurants named Amanda, sucks. I couldn't live in the country. It's so boring. I can't imagine what there is to do there. Well, there are things to do in the country, Amber said with a smile. And what's that? Amanda asked sourly. Less business, milking cows, Miss Kolesnikova inquired in a less friendly tone. If so, you are mistaken. I love the village where, in fact, I came from, and I never let anyone speak ill of it. I'd be glad if you could dissuade me. Amanda smiled, clearly not wanting an altercation. The village has woods, a river, Amber replied. You can also dig in the ground, plant vegetables, flowers, do some gardening. It's fun. Amanda didn't see it that way, and she said, of course, you want the Maldives. But what's good about the Maldives? Say, palm trees, sand. It's all foreign, not ours. But birch trees, daisies, in the morning with a glass of steamed milk, are your own. But it seems that not everyone can appreciate it. After a nice conversation between the 2 ladies, the wife of entrepreneur Randy Kolesnikov fell into disfavor with the spouses of his business partners. At the sight of Amber, they began to whisper, "Oh, it's true what they say. You can take the woman out of the village, but you can't take the village out of her. God knows." Amber, I can guess what they said about her, but it didn't bother her one bit. Let them scratch their tongues if they can't live without it, she thought. If anything, it was Randy's behavior that ticked Amber off. He didn't think to stand up for her. In fact, when the couple arrived home, he reprimanded Amber like a schoolgirl. You have no social skills whatsoever. You could ruin my relationships with some very serious and useful people. Helpful? And what, I wonder, are these puffed-up turkeys useful for? Exclaimed the wife. Perhaps they help you to brighten up a hard day's work. Stupid. The businessman threw down and said he wouldn't take her to any more events, as if Amber was a suitcase and not a beloved wife. There were many such incidents, and eventually she stuttered about divorce. Randy, however, didn't want to hear about it. The image of a model family man was important to him. So what kind of divorce are we talking about? The Kolesnikovs were also trying to keep the family together for the sake of their son, Jason. But if the marriage was starting to crack, it was only a matter of time before it ended. They were too different. Amber loved the country, nature, outdoor activities, while Randy preferred the metropolis and socializing. Amber enjoyed gardening, tending to the flowers, enjoying the heart, and she more than once offered to buy a dacha somewhere far away from civilization. Kolesnikovs had a country house where the family organized large-scale events, but about a garden and a vegetable garden, there was out of the question. The adjacent territory was decorated with faceless landscaping, which was taken care of by a specially hired person. Amber didn't understand why they needed a country house when they could have events at home or on rented grounds. And Randy had ridiculed such activities as picnics in the countryside, saying they were for the cheapskates. But can't I at least plant some flowers? Amber begged. No fooling around. Her husband cut her off. Amber missed those times when they were young, not rich, but infinitely happy. These nostalgic impulses only made Randy laugh. We have everything now, and thank God. In general, the dissonance was evident, and they couldn't or wouldn't compromise. Jason was 16 at the time. Randy did everything he could to keep his son living with him after the divorce. If you couldn't avoid divorce, you could keep your image as a great dad. Amber was hurt and disgusted, but on the other hand, living with Dad guaranteed the boy a good education and a decent future. And after all, no one forbade her to see her son. Jason had visited his mom faithfully for the first time after the divorce, but gradually his visits waned enough. Amber swallowed silently. That. Besides, the guy had to get ready for college, which meant there was no time for a trip to the village. The poor woman guessed that it wasn't so much about time as it was about desire, or precisely, its absence. Lack of attention from her absent father and mediocre upbringing had done its damage. Jason Wilson grew up to be a real nerd. When the kid was applying to economics, Landy told him that after he graduated, he'd work at his firm. The day after a raucous graduation party, Randy had spoken to his son about it, but Jason just brushed it off. He said he had a headache and wasn't ready to discuss it. Well, we'll wait until tomorrow, Randy thought. After the party, what kind of work talk was there to talk about? And they had a lot to talk about. But the next day, there was no talk. Jason was in a hurry, and when his father returned to the subject that evening, he wrinkled his nose like a toothache at the mention of work. "I don't get it. Are you going to sit on my neck?" He frowned. Randy frowned, perplexed. "But why on my neck?" replied Jason with a smile. "I just want to rest. You didn't expect me to be enthusiastic about my job right after graduation." The businessman sighed heavily. Frankly, that was exactly what he'd been expecting, and for a long time. At any rate, Randy himself had done just that. His hard work had been rewarded 100-fold. Randy became the owner of a chain of candy stores, but it seemed nature had taken a break from his son. After his divorce, Randy never married. The opportunity to have fun was given to him, but the businessman felt it was wrong for his son to be raised by someone else's aunt, and he hadn't met the one he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. So Wilson Sarre lived with his son. Randy had had to work hard to get into big business, and he didn't want the same for Jason. Let everything be honorable. A home, a proper education, and a business that he would inherit. Jason, you see, had decided to take a vacation. "Well, how long do you intend to rest? A month? 6? Dean had asked. "But a couple weeks would be fine," Jason said. "Preferably at a campground somewhere." A couple weeks at a campground," Dad asked. Dad boy confirmed, and then added, "Dad, well, you heard it all yourself. Why ask me 100 times? Really, why should I?" Randy chuckled. "All right, you'll get a campground, but after that I don't want to." He glanced meaningfully at his son, and the latter reported cheerfully, "Yes, Comrade Chief." And he's come back clearly rested. Jason seemed to have forgotten his promise. He made excuses like he wasn't in the mood yet and so on. Eventually, a month passed. The son was still doing nothing, having fun, mindlessly spending the money his father, and he, in turn, patiently waited for his heir to finally mature. There was no telling how long Randy would have been patient if Jason hadn't gotten behind the wheel of a brand new foreign car drunk. Luckily, there were no casualties. Unless, of course, you counted the storefront whose owner had demanded a fabulous sum from the Wilsons. "Do you realize how you set me up?" yelled Randy. So much so that his son's ears were ringing. "Yeah, that bitch was just waiting for me to fly by, and no matter which way her MP hubby smears me against the wall, he'll be right." "Well, I'm sorry," Jason repented. "I won't do that again." "I'm sorry, I won't do it again," his father interjected. "Kindergarten, by golly." Anyway, that was how the paternal pain in his chest prevented Randy from finishing his sentence. "What is it?" Jason was startled. But Wilson, sir, slumped in his chair, clutching his heart. "Are they going to call an ambulance now?" whispered Amber, her lips escaping in a murmur, and shook her head. "I need to call Uncle Charlie as soon as possible. Find him on my phone. Cleveland. Why don't you take care of yourself, father-in-law?" Randy heard the voice of his old friend Charles Patrick Myers, head of the cardiology department, and he was relieved to realize he was alive. After all, he hadn't gotten half of what he'd set out to do, including making Jason human. "Yeah," he mumbled that inarticulately again, son, Randy guessed, and the businessman nodded. The men had met about 10 years ago at one of the presentations. The acquaintance turned out to be mutually beneficial. Randy was giving his new acquaintance a good discount on cakes and pies for the holidays, and Kyle organized free examinations for the owner of the pastry shop, and if necessary, hospitalizations for preventative care. After all, Randy was no longer a boy, which meant his health needed constant monitoring, especially with a son like that. Kyle Pavlovich took the businessman in like family. As usual, he provided Randy with a separate room and assured him, "If you have any special requests, I can't promise to bring you cognac and girls, but tea or something tasty is always welcome. I'll come by tonight. Let's talk, huh?" Kyle offered sympathetically. Dusk was slowly but surely settling over the city. The lion's share of the patients were sleeping peacefully, and the old buddies were having a leisurely conversation. "What's there to tell?" The businessman replied with a sigh. "Jason's a weirdo. Thought he'd learn, carry on my business, and he's going downhill. I can't think of a way to rein him in." "The case is young," Constantin remarked. "He'll grow up and take his wits about him. He's not the first, he's not the last. Be patient. I'd like to believe that, but I can't." One thing Randy respected his old buddy for was wisdom. How long had he known Constantine? The man always had good advice, no matter the situation. This time, however, the businessman was a little disappointed. But wouldn't Kyle have any good advice? It was easy to say, have patience, when his remnants seemed about to run out. Well, is that what I did wrong? Randy continued his wailing. Constantine gave him a hard look and asked, you really don't realize what? Well, if I did understand it, most likely I wouldn't be lying here. The surgeon friend spread his hands. I'm not sure it's worth talking about. Just talk already. The businessman waved his hand. Any advice is worth its weight in gold to me now. You might not like it, the doctor warned. Better the bitter truth than the sweet lie, Randy said. So what did I do wrong? Deprive the kid of his mother? He's so deprived. Frankly, he really didn't like Constantine's argument. Well, what did you expect? Mommy snorted. It's obvious. Obviously, it's obvious, Randy muttered slowly. But it's not like I ever prevented them from seeing each other. They've seen each other, returned phone calls, seen each other, returning phone calls, Kyle repeated with irony in his voice. And you're always busy. But then again, what was the point of the whole boyfriend residency thing? Bit in my ear, the businessman admitted. What's there to say now? It's not my fault Jason stopped going to the village. It's his choice. On the face of it, it is, Kyle agreed. But think about it. At the time of your divorce, Jason was in 10th grade, then graduation and enrollment. But to top it off, a teenage infatuation with company stuff. What's with the trips to the country? You never had time for your son. And if Mom had been around, things would have been a lot different. And you know me. I can't stand family matters, but I'll tell you, you and Amber shouldn't have gotten divorced in the first place. And she didn't want to live with me herself. The patient muttered to himself. Did you ask? Mike Constantine turned the conversation in an interesting direction. Randy had hoped Kyle would offer advice on how to deal with his son. When he about Amber, Randy sighed. It was a good point. However, he would not discuss his ex-wife. It was too personal. Bones, it was a mutual decision between me and her. We decided that it was better for us to part and start a new life. Feeling she's alone and you're alone, Kyle stated thoughtfully. Why? Randy had no idea. Why was Amber alone? He could only assume that the grooms in the village weren't great. It wasn't that Amber was alone, though. She'd found some village shepherd and was now planting flowers. When Jason went to visit his mother regularly, Randy asked her how she was doing, casual. The son always replied, she's fine. Once, however, he added, fresher, better looking. Didn't that mean Amber had found her happiness? A woman is like the flowers her ex-wife loved so much. With a good gardener, they bloom and blossom. But that was just Randy's guess. As for the businessman himself, there were plenty of women after his money. Only he wanted to meet one who would love him. But unfortunately, he hadn't met one yet. Randy thought more than once that Amber was the only woman who loved him with all her soul. Randy had other concerns. So he decided to put off talking about love until a better time. But the ward manager, shrugging his shoulders and giving Randy a sly look. By the way, I'm short on orderlies. So, the friend asked, perplexed. So what? Kyle grinned. You were complaining about your son being out of hand. Let him work for a month, and he'll come to his senses. Labor, if you remember, turned a monkey into a man. Randy pictured his son wearing clothes and almost laughed. But there was common sense in the superintendent's words. When a man is busy working, he has no time to think about silly things. The important thing was to keep Jason busy, and it wasn't hard to create conditions that would force him to work hard. The men struck hands. Mr. Smith, you have a visitor, the nurse announced. Smiling, Randy nodded. Kolesnikov was an important patient. The entire staff knew him, and he remembered the names. The visitor was Jason. He didn't look giddy, but a shy schoolboy. How are you feeling? The son asked hesitantly. Better already, Randy smiled. Jason breathed a sigh of relief. God, he felt guilty. I brought you fruit. Oranges, kiwis, mangoes. Washed everything, the boy said. Well, good for you, exclaimed the father. And I have a business talk for you again. I realize that you just don't want to work for my firm. I don't. Randy nodded. But you have to work somewhere, right? I have to, Jason muttered doomily. His father thought it was a case of the saying, well, if it wasn't for luck, it was for misfortune. If that boy had known what was in store for him... So there you go, the businessman summarized. I talked to Uncle Kyle and he said his department is short on orderlies. What's that got to do with me? The son was genuinely surprised. Because our much-respected Kyle is offering you a job as an orderly, said the father. Very funny, Jason snorted. Yeah, I wouldn't say that, the father objected. But the son nodded ironically. I'll think about it. Think about it, son. Think about it, Randy smiled. Jason rode home in a cab and recalled the conversation with his father with a smile. An economics graduate working as an orderly, there was something about that, close to the people, so to speak. The old man had a good sense of humor. Taking advantage of his father's absence, Jason decided to throw a party. Randy is staying here, he told the cabbie. When they pulled up to the supermarket, the boy had a cart full of food and drinks. Looking forward to a fun evening, he moved toward the checkout line. I'm sorry, but there aren't enough funds on the card, said the young cashier. No, it can't be, Jason objected. Check again. First, the line got noisy. What the hell is this? You're supposed to be watching the balance. We have families, kids, he said. Maybe you have another card, the girl asked. Of course I do, Jason replied arrogantly, glancing nonchalantly at the crowd. He pulled out another bank card, but the result was the same. Wait. I have credit, the puzzled boy mumbled. Are you kidding me? Exclaimed a burly woman about 55 years old. I don't have a pair of legs, by the way, and I haven't tried to walk, Jason snapped. She and the shayer said nonchalant. I'm sorry, but your credit card has been blocked. Jason sighed heavily. I think he was beginning to see what was wrong. In the end, he had to pay in cash. He had to give up a good half of the basket's contents, though. As he rode in the cab, he thought, it's been a long time since I've embarrassed myself like this in front of a bunch of assholes. Jason was stunned. He'd been an idiot to take Uncle Kyle's offer ironically. He thought his father was joking about blocking his credit card and all the money on his other cards. My cell phone rang. My dad just told me something interesting from the bank, Randy began curtly. You tried to spend $168. Jason didn't feel like throwing a party. He decided to give Emily a romantic evening. Well, I tried, his son sighed. Now, Randy said, if you want access to money, get a job. But I can't live without money, interrupted the father. No one's arguing. You can't live without it. Only normal people earn money, not sit on the backs of their parents, he said. When I was your age, I worked my ass off. And as you can see, I haven't fallen apart. Why the hospital? I'm not a doctor. Because the prospect of working in a specialty didn't appeal to you, Randy grinned. You can work as a hospital orderly. You don't need a medical degree. The pay's not much, but the food's free. I see, Jason said sadly, imagining the food there. Good, the businessman said approvingly. When you've worked a month, the money will be returned to your accounts and your credit card will be unblocked. You'll find yourself a worthy bride, get married, and live the life of a model family man. What's that for? Jason marveled. Because, son, it's time for you to settle down, Randy answered. Dad, where am I going to find a bride? He asked, almost crying. You could find a bride in a hospital, Randy said. It's all sick people there. What kind of brides are there? What am I going to do with her? But Randy wasn't interested in that at all. How much blood did his son take out of him? A lot. Well, let him see that it's not all work and no play. The heir to the candy store chain took his father's words at face value. Jason had a girlfriend, Emily, but knowing how Randy felt about modern silicone dolls, his son was seeing her in secret. The hospitalization allowed Jason to invite Emily home. Well, we'll discuss our future lives at the same time, he thought with a chuckle. He uncorked a bottle of brandy and drank it. He needed a drink. Emily was as pro-life as her boyfriend. They had a lot of fun and gave her parents a lot of trouble. The phrase, if anything, we'll get away with it, became their credo. Jason busied himself with preparing dinner, downing a quarter of a bottle of brandy. His mood was lifting, and he even managed to find an upside to the situation. Being an orderly, like getting married, seemed like a kind of reality show that could diversify his life. Wasn't that a plus? They would be together forever, which meant that every moment of their life together would be an exciting adventure. That wasn't just a plus, it was a plus. What about the money? I mean, Dad promised to pay back every dime. But I'll keep my word, Jason thought, and took a generous swig of brandy. Emily was as beautiful as ever. Her waist-length platinum hair was like expensive silk, and her flawless, light makeup emphasized the beauty of her bright blue eyes and seductive lips. Jason suspected that this seductiveness was not natural, but the good work of a makeup artist, but he always mentally forgave his lover for this, in general, innocent lie. So what if Emily looked 200%, and the rest? The little things of life. Jay, my sweetie, she said playfully. Hi, doll, Jason said in a husky voice, accepting her expensive summer coat of shiny purple satin. I see you've had a drink, Emily jokingly wagged an intricately manicured finger at him. I have, the boyfriend admitted, and added with a sigh, so what? Come on in. I've prepared a romantic dinner. Romantic dinner. Rounded eyes, blonde beauty. In your opinion, is this something new, eh? But you said yourself that everything in life should be tried. So let's try a little romance. It can't hurt. Is something wrong with my Jay? She asked, powdering her nose. Something happened, he nodded grimly. My dad got me a job. Well, it was bound to happen sooner or later, Emily said. You're the only heir after all. Who better to carry on the business than you? Me, the business. Jason grinned. Unless it's the health department. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. What? She asked. What does the health department have to do with it? Because my dad got me a job as an orderly in the cardiac ward of the city hospital. Emily laughed out loud. Admit it, which one of you was joking? Emily asked her friend after she had laughed. I thought Dad was joking too, Jason grinned wryly. Until he got there. So he meant it. No way. She was surprised, realizing that no one had meant it as a joke. What was I saying? Yes, Emily. It's fun, she said, still impressed by her lover's message. Vova will have something to tell his girlfriends about too. Prude. Marry me, Jason said bluntly. Marry an orderly. It's what I've always wanted to do. He said. It wouldn't be forever, Jason explained. I'm there temporarily as punishment, you know. It'll be like fun reality show. It'll be life among the common people and then the wedding, you know. May say, Emily said deep in thought. You oversleep. Kolesnikov decided to leave. I think I'll go. When will I see you in another life, Jay? She smiled. In another life, Jason was discouraged. His sister's outburst wasn't a very pleasant feeling, though. The next afternoon, he decided to call Emily to set the record straight. Frankly, Jason didn't understand her train of thought. No. Hello? She answered in a sleepy voice. Hey, hello, princess, he said fondly. Who is this? He heard a sleepy man's voice. Hang up the phone and come to me. Jason Jr. was disappointed. His disappointment was immediately replaced by resentment. That's how it is, he thought. That evening, he went on social media and saw a picture of Emily and his buddy Tyler Parker. Here's the sweet couple leaving a nightclub, and here they are at a coffee shop where he's greedily feeding his new fling dessert. Well, Tyler has a nice appetite, Jason thought with a chuckle. I thought you were a friend. He remembered how a little over a year ago, at the beginning of his relationship with Emily, he'd been told by a lazy person that she'd always been fickle, and his classmate Vincent Carver had somehow been too quick to avert his eyes when Jason had been blinded by his passion for Emily. He hadn't given it much thought at the time. Now the truth was clear. I present to you a new employee, Kyle Pavlovich, Mikhailov said with a fatherly smile to his subordinates. Jason Randyevich Kolesnikov is our new orderly. Jason Randyevich, welcome to the team. Thank you, he nodded, suddenly feeling like a lost boy. In a way, he was. The men had agreed that within the walls of this hospital, his father was a stranger to it. Randy was one of the VIP patients, a man from a completely different world. At least to his co-workers and the other patients. You wanted a reality show, Jason chuckled to himself mentally. So get it and sign your name. You're welcome. The ward manager smiled and turned to the handsome, skinny guy who looked a little like a gypsy. Tyler's assigning you a rookie. You see, Jason's in the loop, so explain to him the ins and outs of the job. You know the drill. The kid nodded. All right, let's get to work, Kyle proclaimed, and the employees went about their work. Let's go, Tyler said to Jason, pointing with his eyes somewhere under the stairs. He had no choice but to follow his new colleague. The boys went into a small room, and the mentor, pointing Jason to an old chair, began to outline the duties. Rep ship. Jason raised his eyebrows in bewilderment. What the hell is that thing? It's a receptacle where the bedridden dispose of themselves, Tyler explained with a smile. Am I supposed to clean it up? Jason asked in a low voice. Well, who else would? His coworker chuckled. Not Kyle. You might want to take off your watch. They're going to change your legs. You wouldn't believe the rabble they bring in here. That's what I'll believe, the trainee thought with annoyance. I would rather not believe that normal people are brought here. Unless, of course, you count the VIP patients. Let them try, Jason said with a snort. My father. He faltered when he remembered the contract. But Tyler didn't seem to be the type to be diplomatic. What about your father? He grinned. Judging by your watch, your father's not a poor man. Judging by the fact that you're here, it's not so simple in your noble family. You better watch your family, Jason said. When I have a family, then I'll watch my family, he countered. And since I've been assigned to look after the new employee, I'll confine myself to that. Let's go through the wards and take out those ships you are so interested in. Take the watches off them. Jason thought for a moment but took the watch off. The sight of the sick, especially the elderly, was depressing. They seemed to have an expression of resignation to their unenviable fate. Looking at the older man with the mask-like face, Jason shuddered. He turned sharply, and the contents of the ship were on the floor. Ouch, was all he said. Tyler struggled to keep from laughing, but he managed to control himself and told his ward to clean up the mess. I thought there were special people for that, Jason said, confused. Of course there are, his colleague said with a chuckle. Those people are you and me. And as the person who's supposed to be bringing you up to speed, I can tell you one thing. The sooner you start practicing, the better you'll be at your job. Or maybe you want to offer me money to fix your joint. Jason hadn't planned any such thing, though he had to admit it. It wasn't a bad idea, except there wasn't much money to be made. Anyway, he had to clean up what he spilled. After all, it was really his fault. On his lunch break, Jason asked Tyler if there was a cheap cafeteria nearby. Did you blow your scholarship? He said. Why do you need a cafeteria? This is where they feed the staff. Jason couldn't take it anymore. What do you want from me? I asked a specific question and wanted a specific answer. And I'm satisfied to say Tyler. So you have a temper, huh? Well, you're crazy. The businessman's son dropped those words and headed for the exit. Well, after a closer look at the contents of his wallet, he came to the disappointing conclusion that there wasn't much money in it. So Jason wandered doomedly into the kitchen. To his delight, the hospital food turned out to be quite good. Jason ate the rich borscht and suddenly remembered his vacation in the village. His grandmother's mashed potatoes and cutlets were also excellent, just like his mother's. I should go visit her, by the way. Jason suddenly realized that, for the first time in years, a good human thought had entered his head. And what would that mean? So how was your first day of work? Kyle asked when they arrived at Randy's room at the end of a hard day's work. Apparently fat, Jason complained. I'll probably sleep like a baby tonight. I've never been so tired in my life. Well, the laughter, Kolesnikov's CR, is not for you to ride on, say Kozlov's. Well, how do you like your mentor? Kyle asked. Yes, some concussed. Jason replied with annoyance. He's clinging to me, tearing me down all the time. Don't hurt the orphan, the family friend said. Well, that makes sense, the boy thought. Not that he was prejudiced against orphans, but judging by the individuals involved, everyone owed them a favor. There were a couple of them at the university Jason attended. The lecturer fails the exam. They have a way to cut off the treacherous teachers. If I wasn't an orphan, you wouldn't be so prejudiced against me. Well, and of course, almost impute to the home children that they had everything and above all loving parents, and not so destitute, as if someone was guilty of it in front of them. They wouldn't understand. He thought and limited himself to promising not to hurt the orphan. Andrew didn't know why he was picking on the interns. Yes, a major, but he hadn't done Andrew any harm. Unlike that drunken brat who ran to the car his mother and stepfather were driving. Andrew was only 8 when his life was split into a before and after. His grandparents were gone too. Ever since then, Andrew had hated the majors. And even though the kid realized that Jason wasn't guilty of anything in front of him, he couldn't help it. After 10 days, Randy Kolesnikov was discharged from the hospital, and his son continued to work as an orderly. I must say, Kyle Pavlovich was pleased with him. The head of the department was friendly with Jason, but he didn't even think about doing him any favors. Jason didn't expect any. On the contrary, he was very grateful to Kyle Pavlovich for giving him the opportunity to rethink his life. "How is my son?" asked the head of the department. "How is my son?" He replied, "Your guy is far from hopeless. He's trying." "I don't know how to thank you," Randy replied. "Oh, come on," Mikulev said. "I didn't really do anything special." "No, you didn't. It's worth a lot," Randy objected. After receiving the advance payment, the boy bought some goodies and went to his mother's house. Amber was pleasantly surprised, and they had a great time. Jason returned home and thought that only now the son began to really live, not exist. He held a modest position as an orderly, but he had never been so truly happy. Except that his relationship with Andrew remained strained. The two young men were at odds, and even the most insignificant dispute could turn into a serious bickering. Once, when Andrew once again said some barbs to Jason, he could not help himself and hit his colleague. A fight ensued. The coworkers had to break the guys up. Whatever you say, social inequality should not be underestimated. There's no telling how long it would have lasted if it hadn't been for chance. Andrew approached the smoking room and suddenly heard a woman's voice. "I'm telling you for sure, this Pretzel is the son of the pastry shop owner. What's his name?" "Kolesnikov. Can you catch up?" Another voice answered. "Why does he work as an orderly?" "Well, maybe he just looks like him. And the last name," excitedly exclaimed the lady. And Andrew realized with horror that it was Jenna, the nurse. "But anyway, after lights out, they're going to go clean the restrooms and pick up the labs. And I'll give you the keys to their room, no problem. The cabinets aren't locked because there's nothing to steal. Who knew a royal bird would fly in there?" Jenna giggled. And the door to the smoking room swung open. Andrew barely had time to duck around the corner. Jenna and some unshaven guy came out of the smoking room. Judging by the pajamas, a patient, and judging by the criminal face, Andrew suddenly remembered how the patient had lost money a couple months ago. Coincidentally, Jenna worked that shift, too. Or was that a coincidence? Unlikely, Andrew thought. Oh my God, is Jenna stealing? As if in a dream, he walked into the staff room. Jason was drinking coffee. "Jason," Andrew addressed him. "You wouldn't happen to have any valuables with you, would you?" "Why do you ask?" Jason chuckled. Suddenly, he realized that his colleague had asked for a reason. Randy sat there with a serious look on his face. "Yes," Andrew answered evasively. He didn't want to tell what one of the nurses was doing. Life in the orphanage had taught him caution. "Just stay alert," his partner said and left the room. The change in Andrew's behavior puzzled Jason. But there was no time to think. The only thing of value was an expensive cell phone. When Jason and Andrew finished their work, it was after midnight. "Guys, you're wanted at the post," Amber said, waiting for them outside the staff room. Andrew grinned cheerfully. Jason looked at him in surprise. He calmly opened the door, where a surprise awaited them, a familiar-looking guy in pajamas. In his hands was Jason's wallet, which he quickly tucked behind his back. "What are you doing here?" "I'm checking in." "And you are?" "Yeah, it's all her." The unlucky thief realized he was in big trouble. "And what's behind your back?" "I just cleaned it up." He put his wallet on the table. "I just wanted to take a look, but it was all her," Andrew continued with a chuckle. Anyway, I'm calling the cops." "No." The intruder was scared. "No cops." Jason looked out into the hallway. Amber was gone. "How long have you and Amber been working together?" "We're not a couple," she said. "Rich guy, so He sighed. The cops were called. Turns out Amber had a long history of theft and often helped thieves with tips. The nurse was arrested, and the patient in need of treatment was released on his own recognizance. "Bye." "Thanks, buddy. If it wasn't for you, I'd have gone to the post like a fool and been penniless." "Andrew, you'd be broke?" "Okay, I'll shut up. How did you find out?" "I overheard a conversation." Andrew sighed. "Okay, so peace." "Peace." The guys exchanged a firm handshake and have been friends ever since. It was sensationalized. Some joked that it was one step from hate to love. Others accused Andrew of being self-serving, but the boys didn't care. Out of class animosity grew a real friendship. Jason got to know Andrew's friends and found them to be great guys. They went fishing together, and the businessman's son decided that outdoor recreation was more interesting than nightclubs. Then a young, pretty woman was brought in with heart pains. Upon seeing her, Jason realized he was missing, not without the help of Uncle Kyle. The guys found out her name was Amanda. "Did you see the girl they brought into room 4? You're nodding. "I did. She's cute. I think I'm going to have to get my fishing pole." Merchant's possessions. "A man's sick. Or don't you rich people care about that? Come see." "Andrew, what are you doing?" "I'm not crazy." But Jason didn't realize that the young patient had impressed his friend, too. But is that a reason to give up on love? A few days later, Jason decided to visit Amanda, and they had a nice conversation. When he saw someone leave her room, Andrew gloomed. "How's it going?" What?" "We had a chat." "Andrew." "That's it." "Oh, that's it. So challenge me to a duel." "Andrew, you're laughing. I can see by the look on your face that I've hit the mark." What's there to cry about? The relationship between them grew cold again. Jason sincerely regretted it. While hopelessly in love, Andrew was angry with him. It made Jason sad. But even more troubling to him was the other question. Why was such a young Amanda complaining about her heart and not looking like someone with a congenital vice? "I don't know." Rita shook her head. It had only started recently. And as the doctor says, there are practically no characteristic signs, except for the pain behind the sternum. Her fingernails are quite normal. She glanced down at her hands, and Jason saw the wedding ring. "So you're married?" The boy's voice was disappointed and embarrassed. "Yes," Marguerite nodded. "Why doesn't your husband come to the hospital?" Jason asked. "Oh, that's probably none of my business." "It's no big deal," Rita smiled. "It's just that Victor is busy all the time. He's new to the business, so he has to work hard. He's promoting his firm." "I see what kind of firm Stimulus is." "Stimulus?" "That's what he said." Are you sure?" "Of course. Stimulus has been on the market for a long time," Jason said, puzzled. "It doesn't need any promotion." "I don't know about that. The economics graduate hadn't worked a day in his specialty because of his carelessness. But he knew a thing or two about business, and the firm Stimulus was well known to him. If only because his buddy Oliver worked there. That's who Jason called. "Victor Muratov?" Oliver asked. "No, I'd never heard of him. I could look him up." An hour later, Jason learned that there was no Victor Muratov at Stimulus. And in another hour, he knew that this guy didn't work for any of the firms in the city. "So Victor has been lying to me all along," Rita said, confused. "Why did he take out a big loan in my name? He said he was going to invest it in the business." It was obvious to Jason that the pretty lady's husband was a con man. He got cold feet. This could be dangerous. Sergei had heard many stories about people who took out loans on other people and then disappeared. He wanted to share his thoughts with a smart person and make a plan of action together, like Andrew. But what better reason to make up? His partner, however, met him flatly. "Wow," he said ironically. He decided to play the noble knight, and now he got into trouble. "Andrew, this is a very serious matter, and you can't do it alone. And just so you know, Rita's married." "I'm sorry," Andrew said. "But that's no problem for someone like you." Anyway, we didn't have a conversation. I don't have anyone to talk to now, Jason thought. Maybe my dad? Landy, meanwhile, had his own worries. And it wasn't about another $1 million deal. Since the hospital, he had thought more than once about what Kyle had said about himself and Amber and had come to the conclusion that the situation was indeed unhealthy. And Randy also realized that he had missed someone so dear, so real, all these years. And it's time to start over with her, he thought on the way to the flower shop where he bought all the roses and drove to the village. Randy was in for disappointment. When he arrived, he learned that Amber no longer lived at that address. Moreover, a huge construction site had taken the place of the street. "So where can I find her?" muttered the businessman. The next day, he connected all his connections and found out that one unreasonably enterprising farmer decided to build an elite dacha settlement. And his ex-wife and other residents of the street were forcibly relocated to another place. "What kind of farmer?" Kolesnikov asked, and his tone did not bode well. Randy recognized the name of the enemy and began to make inquiries about him. A lot of interesting facts came to light, which put the farmer's reputation at risk. The meeting with Nicholas Bykow, as he was called, went splendidly. The unflattering things about the farmer had served Randy well, and now Mr. Bykoff would be outed of the elite village. Well, that was good. But where was Amber? A few days later, Randy found her in the middle of nowhere. She was renting a corner from some deaf grandmother. Amber walked out to meet her ex-husband, and his heart suddenly ached. She was so beautiful and so lonely. "Where can we talk?" Randy asked. They walked to the old gazebo. The smell of fall apples hit his nose. "Good to see you." The businessman began awkwardly. "Amber, why didn't you ask me for help? I would have bought you an apartment." "I don't want your apartment," she replied. Amber sighed. "It's long over between us, and we don't owe each other anything." "Yeah, right. But I've been such an ass. I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and anyway, let's start over. I want to be with you, period." "And it took you 6 years to realize that." Through her tears, she smiled. "Better late than never." Disarming, the ex-husband smiled. His cell phone didn't answer. Jason was worried sick. Randy was in the country dealing with his ex-wife's problems. The secretary answered, and the connection was bad. Fun, but message of the rituals was something Jason had been wondering about. Things could still be good at his parents' place. Yes, but who should I consult with now about Marguerite's spouse? So the boy decided to proceed at his own risk. He already knew that Rita didn't have any heart problems. There was a powerful drug in her blood that could trigger a heart attack, Kyle said. Well, did Jason assume something like that? He'd gotten some people involved and finally got Victor Murray to come clean. Rita's husband interjected. Well, let's talk where and when. Tomorrow at 10 p.m. would be fine. Write down the address. The meeting place turned out to be a country house, which looked uninhabited. There was no fence and the yard was overgrown with grass. Is there someone there? Jason asked cautiously. Yes, there is, he was assured by a guy with a predatory face coming out of the kitchen. To what do I owe the honor? What firm do you work for, Mr. Murray? Jason asked him curtly. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. He grinned. That, too. Well, Victor said thoughtfully. Then he threw Jason down on the table, started choking him. As he tried to free himself, he kicked the oil lamp under the table and a fire erupted. Murray screamed. He released his victim and ran out of the house. Jason, rubbing his neck, tried to follow, but the collapsed logs blocked his path. Rita whispered softly. He was losing consciousness. Jesus, exclaimed an elderly vagrant who was passing by. He saw the man trying to get out of the house and rushed to his aid. Hold on, boy. The tramp urged and pulled Jason to a safe distance, called the fire department. And soon, when Andrew saw his partner arriving by ambulance, he nearly fainted. The grudge he'd been harboring against his friend suddenly seemed like nothing. Comrade Koba, Jason survived. Randy loved getting up to the sound of the roosters singing. It was an unforgettable feeling. And when you're with the one you love. Now he was sitting on the porch in the old tracksuit of his late husband's late husband, breathing in the country air, listening to the sound of the river and enjoying nature. Suddenly, two unpleasant men entered the yard and their faces hinted eloquently at their criminal past. Man, there is a bazaar, said one of them. But first, hello, Randy replied nonchalantly. You got that behind the bull? You've got everything and anything, nodded the other. If you don't get it, we'll pull you out of the ground. And then we'll bury you. Or the other one. What are you going to do? Amber asked fearfully. I think I'll take a break and go to town, Randy replied. Let them think I'm scared of them. So let's go. I can't get a hold of you, Kyle said when he did. We get over here right away. Jason, something's wrong, Randy. Your son was hurt in the fire. He's alive. The terrified parents asked in chorus. Alive. Michael nodded. But Jason needs emergency surgery, or he risks losing his children for the rest of his life. And the operation requires a blood transfusion. There were plenty of people willing to donate blood, but Andrew was the only suitable donor. But now you and I are blood brothers. He thought with a smile as he looked at Jason, still awake from the anesthesia. Despite the blood loss, Andrew felt great. When Jason saw his parents together, he couldn't believe his eyes. He's awake, his mother said, laughing. Oh, you, his father said jokingly. But who goes alone to meet such people? Do you already know? We know a lot more than that. Randy smiled and began to tell his son about his misadventures. Victor Murray was apprehended shortly after the fire, and he turned out to be Bykoff's son. And the last name? Jason noted. The poisoner's parents were married, Randy explained. The fact that the farmer's son turned out to be the poisoner played to his advantage, helping him win in court and saving the villagers from forced eviction. There was another great moment. Andrew found his birth father. When he saw his friend's savior, he almost fainted. Staring at the boy was an aged and battered copy of himself. Randy even had a mole under his lip. The guy asked the tramp in an expensive former voice, "Your mother's name wouldn't happen to be Andrew, would it?" "It was," Andrew replied. "Mom died." "My God, kingdom of heaven to her." The man crossed himself and told him that years ago he had a relationship with Andrew's mother. "We broke up. And I didn't even know that Vera was pregnant," Ivan said with a sigh. "And then I started gambling, lost my place. So Randy took me on as a manager for a farm he started in the village." "A manager?" Ivan asked incredulously. "That's too much for me." "It's all right," Randy assured him. "The man who saved my son's life is the only position he deserves." 3 months passed. God's servant Randy and God's servant Amber are married, the priest chanted, and goosebumps ran down Jason's skin. These two were his parents. "You and I are getting married too," Jason whispered to Rita as they walked out of the church. "So you haven't even proposed to me yet," she laughed. "I believe I have. Andrew will be a witness, easy," his friend assured her. And a month later, Jason and Rita were married. "You see, Elizabeth is your daughter, all right," Sharon said in a confident tone as she examined little Holly. She had just turned 2 months old, but she seemed to have grown a couple of centimeters since her last visit. But thank goodness, the young mom exhaled with relief. "Thank you, Sharon, for coming right away. As soon as I saw the rash, I started imagining all sorts of horrors. I thought of all kinds of things." "And do not need unnecessary imagination," said the pediatrician after checking the arms and legs of the baby for the last time. "It is better to call me right away, and then you yourself are nervous, and the child with his mood worry. She feels everything, even though she's just a baby. Right, Holly?" Sharon smiled at the baby, and she bounced happily in response. "Oh, what would we do here without you?" Elizabeth said sincerely, putting her hand to her heart. "How good it is that they send such wonderful and caring specialists to us in such a remote area." Sharon said nothing. She smiled politely and began to pack her medical case. The woman turned 35 this year, but she worked and lived in a small southern village lost in the depths of Siberia. For almost 2 years now, Sharon had been assigned a small, bright house and her own office in the local hospital, the only one for many dozens of kilometers around. Despite the fact that Sharon, being a native of Moscow, was accustomed in her work and daily life to completely different conditions, the modest and somewhere even harsh life of the Siberian wilderness did not frighten her at all. The woman found in such an existence a kind of special spirituality, like that felt by monks, praying in their ascetic cells in ancient monasteries. Sharon. Wait. The pediatrician heard a familiar voice behind her. Charlotte. A kind-hearted, blonde-haired woman who worked on a local farm was hurrying toward her, carrying a large, labeled can. Charlotte, don't shout like that. You mustn't shout. You might fall," she said, looking at the woman rushing toward her. The milkmaid only waved her hand. "What can I do?" "We're all used to it here," Charlotte said, puffing out her breath after a brisk walk. "Sometimes you rush in at dawn, don't you? You think she'll be all right, especially if she's expecting a calf." "Sharon, I brought you some fresh milk," said the villager, holding out a can to the pediatrician. It was a particularly good milk yield. "No, Charlotte, no need," tried to refuse the doctor. But the milkmaid was very persistent. Take it, she shook her head. "Do you know how much of this stuff I have at home? But you still need it more. Your work is so important. You treat our children every day until night on rounds. It's not just milk, it's nothing." Charlotte just did not spit on the ground from irritation, remembering the previous pediatrician. "For you, do you know what kind of doctor she was? She basically didn't care about the kids. Only did what came to the hospital to gossip, all the gossip we'll discuss. She'd put all kinds of makeup on her face and twirl her tail in front of our paramedic." Sharon hurried to take the can and thank the woman. She sensed Charlotte was about to get back on her favorite horse. And so she did. But whatever that St. Petersburg goat does, Charlotte continued to rage, no matter how much she tortured him. Vincent wouldn't even notice her, for crying out loud. "I hear you, Charlotte, but I really have to go. I've got a lot of paperwork to do at the hospital." But Charlotte was unstoppable. She couldn't rest until she'd spoken her thoughts and feelings to the end. That was her broad country nature. "Vincent's a different kind of bird. He's a what's-his-name, isn't he?" The woman thought of the right word and was silent for a moment. "Aesthete. That's not the kind of girl he wants." Charlotte looked at Sharon with a cheerful slyness and finished. "Like you would find my wife quiet, calm, so that in the children of her soul to put her soul." The young pediatrician was embarrassed, feeling herself blushing to the roots of her hair. "Sharon, please," Charlotte continued. "You should look at him, and Vincent, as soon as he lost his wife. So consider, 5 years as a widower. He doesn't fit in here. He came to us from the capital too." Sharon truly wanted to go to hell at that moment. She quickly mumbled something about not having time. She thanked him again for the milk and hurried away from the chatty Charlotte. Everyone, literally everyone in the village, was wooing her to Vincent, the local paramedic. Sharon didn't argue he was a good-looking man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a gait full of dignity, and only 5 years older than her. But despite the attention Vincent was showing her, Sharon didn't reciprocate it. To her, the handsome widower paramedic was just a pleasant colleague who had no feelings for her at all. And how could it be otherwise when the young pediatrician's heart was forever occupied by another man, her own husband? Sharon hurried to push the sad thoughts away. All the more so as the modest, beige and light gray building of their rural hospital loomed ahead. As she walked up the porch steps, she thought about how lucky she was that the people here had received her so warmly and friendly. Not every stranger from the capital city could win the trust of the villagers. Sharon, however, had managed to become practically one of their own. It was largely because she was literally obsessed with her work. And now, entering her cozy little office, the woman wanted to start filling out some paperwork right away, when her attention was attracted by a huge, lush bouquet on her desk. Someone had managed to put the flowers in a vase so that a wonderful fresh fragrance spilled over the room. That's not all that flashed through Sharon's pediatrician's mind. "I've asked you so many times," she sighed. "Sharon." Knock, knock. "Can I see you?" Vincent's perfect white smile brightened as he slowly pushed his way between the door and her office. "Good afternoon," Vincent Sharon said with a strained smile. "I assume these are flowers from you? Do you like them?" "I thought I'd cheer you up a little. You've been looking a little sad lately. Are you all right?" Sharon put the bouquet under the table and exhaled confidently. "The bouquet is beautiful. You didn't have to go to all that expense." She turned her gaze back to the flowers. "It was enough to wish me a good day. We've been over this, Vincent. I'm very much against any kind of attention in the workplace. Outside of work, too." Vincent's smile faded a little, but the man had no intention of giving up without a fight. "You know, Sharon, sometimes I think you're teasing me on purpose," the paramedic said without changing his face. "I just don't understand why you're doing this to me. To be honest, I'm starting to run out of ideas about what else I could do to please you." Sharon looked tiredly at the persistent suitor. "Vincent, how many times do you have to do this? How can I explain to you that there can be nothing personal between us? I know it's hard for you to accept the fact that I don't want to go out with you. But let's face it, we just want different things out of life. Our personalities don't match." Sharon looked at the paramedic pleadingly. She'd lost count of the number of times she'd tried to explain such seemingly elementary things to him. "It's because you still love your husband?" the man asked her painfully. Vincent knew that Sharon didn't like to talk about her past life in the capital, and yet he never missed an opportunity to remind her of her reasons for moving to Yelchihu. Sharon's face instantly became impenetrable. "I'm sorry, Vincent, but I'm really busy right now. I'm afraid we have nothing more to talk about." "I understand your feelings as well as anyone," Sharon, Vincent said in a serious tone. "Believe me, I've been where you are. But sooner or later, you're going to have to get back to real life. Sometimes we have to accept the fact that our nearest and dearest are gone. By letting go of the situation, you can finally look around you and see that there are people around who care about you. I'll be waiting for you. Sharon. I hope you soon realize that you and I have a good chance of making a wonderful family. Sharon looked at the paramedic. Her lips were trembling and her eyes were full of tears. Vincent, please. The woman cried out, pale, unable to contain her emotions, and then she burst into a womanly sob, dropping her head into her hands. Cry, Sharon, cry. Vincent said softly as he left her office. Maybe tears will sober you up. How many times do you have to act like a lady of steel? The woman didn't answer him. She just couldn't talk right now. So the paramedic had to leave her, leaving Sharon with the solitude she wanted. Sharon's mood was completely and utterly ruined. The pediatrician spent the rest of the day filling out the medical records of her young patients and their mothers, as well as seeing the babies in the hospital. The young woman tried to behave as usual, friendly and polite. However, there were cats on her soul. A familiar dull ache, coupled with intense anxiety, had begun to gradually fill her heart ever since Vincent had made her think of her husband again. Ryan, she said to him mentally every time she felt unbearably tormented. I believe we'll meet again. Let others say whatever they want. Remind me that you're probably not alive anymore. I don't believe it. I don't believe it, and I never will. You're so strong, so brave. You couldn't just die then, you couldn't. In the evening, getting ready for bed, Sharon sat for a long time in front of the mirror, looking at her face, which had stopped from heavy thoughts and worries. Who would have thought that in just 3 years the once young, energetic Sharon would suddenly turn into a grief-stricken woman whose gray hair, openly competing with the silver threads in her once perfect dark blonde hair, made her look much older and more serious than she really was. The young pediatrician used to love to read before bed, not professionally, but the most popular fiction she could get her hands on. Favor, in those days, living in the capital, the girl did not lack books. Here the maximum that she could afford was the magazine Bulletin of Medicine, and that by subscription, which she had so thoughtfully registered at the post office on the very day she moved to the village. No online store had ever delivered books to such a remote region. Yes, to be honest, Sharon was no longer drawn to the twisted detective stories or the magical adventures in a love story that she had once loved so much. The world had long ago lost all color for her, and only her work had kept the woman afloat. Immersing herself in the problems of newborns and their young, and sometimes not so young mothers, Sharon thus quenched her own pain, which every time stung her in the very center of her soul. It was worth it for the woman to remember that she herself was incapable of having children. Sharon stood up from the table where the small mirror stood, and out of the corner of her eye she noticed how thin and unattractive her figure had become. The expression that love dries a lonely woman dry described her at that difficult time in her life. She was lonely, and she loved with all her heart and soul, wholeheartedly and boundlessly one and only one person, who most likely was no longer alive. But pediatrician Sharon Kuznetsova couldn't even bear the thought of, as Vincent put it, resigning herself to letting go. Despite all the blackest moments of her reflection, there was still a faint hope in the same heart where the unrelenting pain now lingered. The hope that lifted Sharon in the morning every day and made her believe that one day she would hear the familiar warm voice of her adored husband. That night the woman could not sleep a wink. She kept returning her thoughts to her past, to those wonderful and easy years when she and her husband were truly happy, and nothing had marred their quiet family joy. They had made great plans for the future, and were completely unaware that all their hard-won happiness could collapse in an instant. Sharon felt tears running down her cheeks again. "Oh my God," the woman whispered to herself. "Ryan, honey, I'm sorry I'm such a sentimental fool." Before the inner gaze of poor Kuznetsova again involuntarily flashed colorful pictures of the years lived with her husband, gradually plunging the woman into a strong, but so simultaneously beautiful and sad dream, which the healer of children's diseases would prefer not to see at all, so as not to be even more emotional after her imminent awakening. Sharon had once had a very different life. Bright lights of the capital, work in one of the best clinics of the city, weekend meetings with her friends, and shopping trips to fashionable boutiques. All this was an integral part of the young pediatrician's daily routine. Sharon was born into a good and respected family of doctors. Her mother worked in gynecology all her life, while her father was one of the leading surgeons in Seattle itself. The girl always saw the example of her parents in front of her eyes. Strong, purposeful, they went straight to their goal and achieved everything themselves, thanks to their own diligence and natural talents, as well as the desire to constantly learn and develop in their chosen field. But besides all this, they also loved each other without memory, despite the fact that they lived together for almost 25 years. Their daughter dreamed of continuing the noble dynasty of doctors, choosing for herself the direction of pediatrics. Thus, Sharon was able to combine in one profession at once two of her passions, medicine and work with children. The girl studied easily and with pleasure, and easily graduated from medical school with honors, after which almost immediately got a job in one of the best consultations in the city. From there, she slowly moved to an excellent private clinic, where she worked for the next few years, gradually improving her professional qualifications. She met Ryan as a mature and self-sufficient young woman. She was 26 years old at the time. The young employee of the rescue service conquered Sharon by his strength, virility, but at the same time softness and kindness. Sharon had never met a man as understanding as Ryan. At that time, she had already had several unsuccessful romances, and she was disappointed in the opposite sex, intending to devote herself fully to work alone. That year, she and a couple of other specialists from the clinic were sent under a general quota for training in the so-called survival course. And that's where the girl first saw her future husband. The muscular blonde instructor immediately made her heart beat faster. His neat 3-day stubble looked so natural, but at the same time stylish, that Sharon involuntarily thought to herself, is he not watching her in some special way to keep her in such an attractive condition for all women? Being naturally shy and modest, Sharon didn't know for sure if this amazing young man would pay attention to her. So she simply continued her studies, trying to focus on the main thing she'd been sent here for. "Did you like our handsome instructor too?" Sharon Tora, her roommate in the student-employee dormitory and part-time young gynecologist, prodded her. "Now that's the kind of guy who's got some dignity. I've seen the way he carries himself. Like he knows he's got manners superior to any of us. We'll be on the hook in no time." "You got it, Tora." Sharon shrugged it off. She felt the color flood her normally so calm and clear face. "What are you talking nonsense again? He's handsome, of course, but nothing more than that," she said. "You were staring at him when he was giving CPR to that mannequin." She made a joke about her, that's all. "I imagined him doing the same to you." Tora rolled her eyes dreamily. Sharon just pressed her lips tighter together, looking down at her adorable nose. "Fuck, Tora. You look like a grown-up girl, but you're acting like a teenager, honestly. It's disgusting." "What's disgusting? You think if you act like a saint, he'll pay attention to you right away." Tora easily straightened her curly hair with her fingers. "You have to be brave, Sylvia. Now, men have long ago not modesty and women appreciate, and what is scientifically called initiative. Let others take the initiative." "I'm a fan of more classic courtship," Sharon said calmly. "If we're to meet, he'll be the first to announce his intention. And I, as a decent girl, will see if I should build a relationship with him, or if he's just a frivolous man, in a word." Tora shook her head reproachfully. "That's why Peter and Nick both ran away from you with their heels glistening. You're too picky. Do you think long and hard before you make the first move? Look, Sylvia, there's a lot of pretty girls here besides you and me. They might be ahead of you." "I don't want him." "Tora, calm down." Sharon had no stomach for it, but then she felt her heart racing, as if she were already jealous of Ryan's jealousy of some ephemeral other hottie her roommate had just told her about. All right, I'll shut up," Tora smiled, turning in her bed to her other side and adding, "Tomorrow we have our final class. There it is, your chance, take it. Or are you going to miss out on your happiness again?" Sharon didn't say anything. She just turned her back to the wall. Her face burned like she'd been rubbed with red pepper. Her heart was galloping in her chest, so that she thought Tora would hear that strange sound in the silence of the night room. It was the first time since their last breakup, or perhaps in her entire life, that Sharon had felt such strong emotions toward a complete stranger. What nonsense, the girl said to herself. Brian's? You haven't exchanged a word with him in 2 weeks, and already you're asking him to marry you? You fool, go to sleep. Tora's right. Tomorrow's the big day, the last class, which she needs to pass with flying colors. And she came here for a reason? With such exciting thoughts, the girl fell asleep that night. Strange as it may seem, the next day went quite smoothly. Sharon passed the exam with a solid A and was preparing to go with the other girls to the creative evening, organized for them by the base staff. At the moment when the girl was scrutinizing herself in the mirror, trying to make sure that the dress she had chosen was not too short for such an event, a quiet knock sounded at the door of her room. "Come in, who's there?" The girl shouted into the hallway, while adjusting the massive round earrings of silver and enamel in her ears. Someone silently came inside and stopped behind Sharon's back. The girl flinched when she saw a familiar, but unexpected reflection in the mirror. "Is that you? God, you scared me," Sharon exclaimed, turning around. In front of her stood the same instructor, Ryan Smith, whom she had been thinking about so often the last few days. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that at all," the boy said, and lowered his stunning blue eyes in embarrassment. In his hand was clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, which he, shyly, slowly extended to the girl. "Here, this is for you." "I'm sorry, I didn't know what kind of flowers you prefer, but we have amazing nature here. So I thought maybe the local flora would make you happy." Sharon looked up at him, her dark gray eyes wide with amazement. Ryan's face gradually flushed with a delicate blush, just as it must have done on her skin now. "It's my pleasure," she said, taking the bouquet from him. "They are really beautiful flowers, better than any roses." A shy hopefulness flashed in Ryan's eyes. "I was wondering if you wouldn't mind going to the dance with me. We're having some sort of disco at the end of the night. It's funny, of course, grown men dancing to popular tunes. But still, I've been looking at you since last week." He was embarrassed. "I apologize for being so frank, but Sharon, I like you very much, so I'd like you to do me the honor of spending this evening with me as my companion." Sharon's excitement made her speechless for the first minute. To think of it, the harsh-looking lifeguard turned out to be such a gentle and vulnerable person. One could never guess what was behind the facade of a male brutality and outward calmness. Ryan, it turned out, had been feeling the same way she had. "Of course I'll say the honor," she replied jokingly, and smiled sweetly at her chosen one. "Just promise me that you won't smoke too much. You know, there is nothing worse than a partner who smokes before the dance. I just can't stand cigarette smoke very well." Ryan's face lit up with a bright and pleasant smile. "That's a wish I can easily fulfill by pretending to be a fairy genie," the young man said. He folded his hands in the typical genie gesture and bowed slightly to Sharon. Sharon didn't know where to put her embarrassment. "God, forgive me for this indiscretion," she exclaimed. "I should have known that many of your employees are in favor of a healthy lifestyle. It's just that both of my previous admirers were not averse to the occasional cigarette. And it was a pain in the ass for me." Sharon looked into Ryan's blue eyes and bit her tongue. Who was she to bring up past men? But today the lifeguard took her words to heart. He didn't seem at all embarrassed by the mention of the girl's past romances. Ryan, giving her his elbow like a real gentleman, took her straight to the local house of culture, where the lifeguards had already prepared a wonderful concert for all the students with jokes, poems, and even songs of their own composition. Sharon liked the latter very much and made a great impression on her. That evening the girl listened to a real bard's song for the first time. "Thank you for this wonderful evening," she thanked her companion when the dance was over and they slowly walked under the blossoming apple trees to the girls' dormitory. "It's been a long time since I've felt so, I don't know, so free. I guess it was so easy to get away from the daily routine and the ubiquitous hustle and bustle." "Yeah," Ryan said, agreeing with her. "I've always felt that this place has a special energy. It's like nothing special, just an ordinary base in the suburbs. But once you get a few kilometers away from the city, it's like a whole different world. No high rises, no shopping centers. At every step there is only a quiet, measured life, where everyone can find his real place." Sharon looked at Ryan and couldn't believe her happiness. Here he was, the man who understood her inner state more than anyone. No matter how much she loved the city with its frenzied pace of life, bright, sometimes shouting windows, ubiquitous cafes and stores, but only here, many kilometers away from the metropolis, she truly felt what life was. It was as if all her senses were heightened in an instant, giving her some secret, but at the same time so simple knowledge. Every person has a true purpose. It is only necessary to follow it at the call of your heart, and then harmony and grace will come into your life. Sharon suddenly looked at him seriously. "Ryan," she said, "can I see you again? I don't mean to be impertinent, but I just think that something good could happen between us." "Sure," Ryan assured her calmly. "Let's exchange phone numbers. I'll text you as soon as I get into town." Ryan smiled so joyfully and childishly that Sharon's heart was immediately warmed by the warmth of the light feeling that was budding in her soul. Back in the metropolis, Sharon thought a lot about what this amazing trip had given her. Should she write to Ryan herself? Or was it better to wait until he was free to make the first move? The girl's doubts were dispelled when a few days later she received the following message on her phone: "I'll be in town the other day. Do you want to meet in the park?" Without thinking for a second and trembling with joy, Sharon immediately replied, "Yes, I'll be looking forward to seeing you." The girl received a playful smiley face in response, and then exhaled with relief. It seems that a new stage in her life was beginning. The first date was followed by several more, and soon the relationship between the young people became really serious. Ryan and Sharon couldn't seem to spend a day apart. They were constantly on the phone, calling each other and sending each other cute postcards. Just like young college students just getting their first taste of true love. Less than 6 months later, Ryan proposed to Sharon. The girl naturally agreed, promising the young lifeguard that she would make him the happiest man in the world. "I'm the one who should promise you such things." Baby Ryan kissed his bride and said, pleasantly surprised, "Remember, a man's duty is to take care of his woman and give her only love and joy, but also to protect her." "You'll never regret being my wife," Ryan said to Sharon. Sharon's parents approved of their daughter's choice. Ryan instilled confidence in them and said the normal, right things. And after talking to Dustin, the girl's father, he became like family to them. "I grew up in an orphanage," Ryan told them honestly, "but I know what a real family should be like. Sharon had told me a lot about your relationship with Brenda. If I can come even an inch closer to something like that in my marriage to your daughter, I'd be happy." "It's good that you intend to make my daughter happy," Dustin told him. "But what about the fact that your job is dangerous? You might leave me alone. What then?" That question didn't bother Ryan at all. "We have all the security measures in place at the base. Yeah, there's a monthly diagnostic on vehicles and equipment. And in case of any damage, parts or technically important parts of the equipment are replaced immediately." Ryan spoke to the bride's father as if he were reporting on the condition of the facility to his superiors clearly and precisely, so that the man had no doubts. His job, though it entailed a risk to life, they had everything they needed to avoid that risk. As for Brenda, she accepted her future son-in-law as if he were her own son. The woman was worried that Ryan, being from an orphanage, had not received enough maternal warmth in his childhood, and therefore at every opportunity she tried to feed the young man with homemade pastries or hot soup. "Try this bread," Sharon's mother said, setting a plate of her specialty soup in front of Ryan. "I made it especially for you. I had a feeling you and my daughter would drop by today." Ryan was embarrassed to refuse, even though Sharon's mom's soup seemed a little heavy for him. As he thanked Brenda for the treat, he chuckled at Sharon, who also understood, but couldn't stop her mother's kindness. "I don't suppose you've ever had soup like this before." Brenda continued to fuss over Ryan. "Sharon can make it too. Don't forget to remind me more often. She's been doing nothing but eating on the run lately with her job." "She can't do that now. She's getting married, after all. And now it is already normal for him to feed and eat well, so that the baby you have soon." Sharon blushed like a boiled lobster. Come on. What baby? What baby? We're not married yet. We're not even getting married for another month. Ryan and I wanted to live a little for ourselves before we thought about kids." There was an awkward silence. Ryan looked expressively at his fiancée and then at his parents' disappointed faces. "A little bit." "How long is this going to take?" Brenda asked with sadness in her voice. "I hope you won't be one of those modern couples who think it's better to have 3 cats, a dog, and a parrot than to have a couple of big kids. You're not one of those, are you?" What? No, of course not, Sharon exclaimed immediately. I can't believe you would think such a thing. Ryan and I are perfectly normal people, and we're going to have kids. Just not so soon. I want to work a little longer, to finally realize I'm a professional first. Honey, there's nothing stopping you from pursuing your interests in pediatrics and being a mom at the same time, Dustin said reasonably. We're not old anymore, and we'd like to nurse our grandchildren while we still have the energy. All Sharon wants to say is Ryan suddenly joined the conversation, that she and I have decided to wait a year or two until we decide we're ready for a baby. No one's talking about taking away the joy of having grandchildren, Dustin, his future son-in-law, reassured him. Well, if that's the time frame we're talking about, that's fine, Dustin chewed his lip. All right. You can live for yourself for now. Just don't take too long. Sharon's at the right age. There's no telling what kind of pregnancy complications might arise if she wanted to have a baby after 30. Sharon clutched the spoon as hard as she could. As much as she loved her parents, such concern about her condition and the possibility of giving birth made her slightly panicky. The girl had always known she wanted to be a mother, but she wanted to decide for herself at what age and exactly how that would happen. Her father and mother kept pushing her, scaring her that her childbearing age had already crossed, in their opinion, all reasonable boundaries. Sharon still had fresh memories of how upset Brenda had been when she had broken up with her last boyfriend. Or rather, the real reason for her upset had not been her daughter's personal tragedy, but the fact that she hadn't thought to get pregnant by her boyfriend so that she could, as her mother had put it at the time, have a baby for herself and thereby bring closure to their family. Sharon felt Ryan squeeze her other hand under the table. His gaze seemed to say to her, "Calm down, this doesn't change anything. We're still going to do things the way we want to do them." Sharon smiled at her fiancé and thought again about how lucky she was to have met a man who truly understood her. Sharon's wedding was modest. On the groom's side were only a few of his best friends from the squad. On the bride's side were friends, relatives, and a couple of her father's good friends, who had been specially invited from the Department of Health. Sharon and Ryan had decided on purpose not to have a lavish celebration. They were going to use some of the money they had saved for the down payment on the mortgage. Young people dreamed of their own apartment, as Sharon all this time lived with her parents, and Ryan and et al. On a rented apartment. However, Brenda and Dustin gave the couple a royal gift for the wedding. "Here," Dustin said to Ryan, handing him the keys to their new apartment. "It's a 2-bedroom in the center of town, close to the subway. 10 minutes and Sharon can easily get to the clinic without traffic. And you'll be able to take a shortcut to your job, too." Ryan didn't know how to thank his father-in-law, so he just hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Dustin," the groom said sincerely. "If you only knew how grateful we are." "Don't mention it," said the bride's father. "I do it first of all for my daughter, to make her life more comfortable. You take care of her and do not forget about the grandchildren. My mother and I will be waiting for them very much." The elderly surgeon reminded his son-in-law, and then jokingly wagged his finger at Ryan. When she learned that she and her husband would now have their own apartment, Sharon squealed with delight and threw herself on her father's neck. "Daddy, my love," she said, kissing her father on the cheeks. "You are the best. My darling. How did you and Mom manage it?" Dustin said, infected with joy for his daughter. "I knew you'd be getting married soon. So my mom and I decided to prepare a family nest for you in advance. We're not animals. We know how hard it is for young people to get their own place these days." Sharon and Ryan felt the happiest they'd ever felt. They bravely looked forward to the future and believed that a long and wonderful family life was ahead of them. The first 2 years flew by like a blink of an eye for the young family. Sharon worked at the clinic all the time, and in the evening she turned into a desperate housewife, always cooking something delicious and unusual to please her husband, returning late at night from his dangerous service. Ryan, on the other hand, was constantly on the road. He had been in all kinds of extreme situations. Sharon, of course, worried about her husband with all her heart. And every time she waited with bated breath for a call from him. But God willing, everything was fine, despite the fact that Ryan had to pull people out from under the rubble, and for zealous fishermen chase away from the pond that was half standing, and much more. And then a joyous event happened in their family. One evening, when Ryan returned from work, Sharon met him with eyes burning with happiness and slyly glittering. "What is it, honey? What's wrong?" asked his beloved wife. "I have a surprise for you," Sharon told him confidentially and pulled him into the living room. There on the exquisitely set table, Ryan was waiting for a festive dinner, which he had not received from his wife for a long time. In the center, a large French baked chicken and wine awaited him on a huge porcelain platter. Nearby in pots lay boiled sweet potatoes and corn and fresh seafood, which Sharon had thoughtfully laid out on a separate platter. On the other side of the table, appetizing fruit was in a tall vase, and a bottle of excellent wine stood next to it. And for some reason, a carton of orange juice. "Wow," Ryan marveled sincerely. "We're having such a party for some reason." The man kissed his wife and looked at her questioningly. "Did you get a promotion?" "Well," Sharon said evasively, "you could say that. Just not as much of a promotion as you'd think." "Yes," said the husband, intrigued. Then his wife sent him off to wash his hands while she laid out clean napkins. She really wanted to make this evening memorable for them for a long time, and for that everything had to look just perfect. "But what's the surprise?" Ryan asked a little later, when she sat him down at the table and put the steaming chicken on his plate. "I'm all excited to find out." Ryan jokingly jingled his fork and knife, showing that he was both very hungry and waiting for his wife's response. "I'll tell you everything now, just for starters." "Open the juice and wine, please." "I can have juice." Ryan didn't understand his wife's hint at first and started calmly unscrewing the cork from the bottle of wine. "Wait, why do you want juice?" When it suddenly dawned on him. Sharon tried unsuccessfully to suppress a smile, but she could feel herself starting to blush again. She covered her lips with her hand and looked at her husband eloquently. "You mean you're pregnant?" Ryan asked quietly. Sharon lowered her eyes, then nodded affirmatively. "God, baby, we're having a little one." "Oh, honey, sweetheart, I'm so happy," he exclaimed. "And I'm going to be a father, a father." Ryan almost dropped the bottle, trying to jump up from the table and hug his wife. When he succeeded, he twirled Sharon in a joyful waltz. The young woman laughed and never took her eyes off her beloved husband for a moment. "How many things do we have to do with you now?" hastily said, excited by the happiness of parenthood man. "We need to decide where the nursery will be, the crib to choose. Have you told your parents yet?" "Not yet," with a laugh, shaking her lush hair, his wife answered him. "We'll tell them together when we go to Mom and Dad's next weekend." Ryan nodded understandingly. "God, Sharon," I thought, "this is happiness. A loving wife and a hot dinner every day, a loyal support system. But this is something else entirely. I love you so much, my darling. I love you so much." Or Ryan and Sharon. An exciting but beautiful day began. Everything seemed to be the same as before, but now every evening they were together doing things inherent in all future parents. Together they chose a stroller for the baby. They dreamed how they would paint the wall to which they would put the baby's cradle. They argued about whether it would be a boy or a girl, and what name they would give their future baby. One day, when Sharon was already 3 months pregnant, she and Ryan decided to spend a cultural weekend, and therefore went to the theater. There was a new production of the opera The Flying Dutchman, and Sharon really wanted to see it. The play struck a young woman with its scenery and the powerful play of actors. The evening promised to be unforgettable, because after the theater Ryan offered to go to a restaurant. "But after such a 3-hour spectacle, you and I should definitely have something special to eat," Ryan said cheerfully to his wife as they left the theater. "You must be awfully tired. I'd be a terrible husband if I made you cook something at home after all this. No, let's go eat somewhere nice." "If you do that, you'll be the perfect husband," Sharon agreed. "Honestly, I'm ready to eat an elephant right now, or at least a hippopotamus. Those tiny sandwiches in the theater cafeteria didn't impress me at all." Dinner went great. Sharon was getting ready to remember it as one of the most beautiful nights of their lives when the unthinkable happened. The couple was on their way out to the parking lot. Ryan had hailed a cab, and it should have been here any minute, when 3 strange men blocked their way. Judging by the dilated pupils and peculiar odor, these types were clearly under the influence of alcohol or some kind of substance. All three had tattooed arms. "Guys, look at the lovebirds," one of them shouted to the others, and the group instantly began to study Ryan and Sharon. Ryan realized at once what was going on. He threw up his hands in a peaceful manner. "Hey guys, don't worry. Let's break this up amicably. We don't need any trouble." He pulled his wallet out of his jacket pocket and took out all the cash he had. Everything he had. "Guys, really take it, go with God. My wife and I just want to go home." That's all Ryan said as calmly as possible. But Sharon, frozen in terror, could feel how tense her husband was. The tallest of the three, obviously the leader of the gang, glanced at the small sum Ryan was offering him. Then he took a couple of steps toward Ryan and snatched the money from his hands in one swift movement. Like a monkey finding a new toy at the bottom of its cage, the bandit jumped up and down in front of his henchmen. "Look," he waved the bills in front of their faces. "The people are understanding nowadays. I'm glad I like it." "It's boring," one of them said in a nasty voice, and then he stared at Sharon. "No fights, no chicks for once." The bald, stout man took a slow step toward Ryan's wife. "I think this one's pretty good," the bastard said. "Juicy sweet. Don't you want to have some fun with some normal guys?" Ryan was instantly eager to fight. Sharon felt her mouth go dry. A second later, a nasty, sour lump rose from somewhere in her throat, making the woman instinctively clutch at her stomach, where the life of her small child lay. Fear. A nasty animal fear for the life of her husband and their unborn son or daughter was what Sharon felt at that moment. She pressed herself against her spouse's back, closing her eyes for a second. "Don't go near her," asshole Ryan threw in his face and immediately assumed a fighting stance. "One move and you could kiss your worthless life goodbye." "Wow, this praised piece of shit can also talk," the third bandit, who was very muscular, answered instead of his comrade. "Science. Try saying that again." With these words, the bastard pulled out a shining folding blade, suspiciously resembling a razor. "Not so brave, eh?" said the fat man enigmatically, pointing to his friend's arm. "Now, my friends and I will quickly clean up your face, so that you know how to talk to respectable people. Will your new clothes come with us? Don't worry, it's not far to the nearest bushes." All three of them laughed like old hyenas. Ryan was like a rock, ready to make a death-defying leap. "When I say run, just run. Don't look back," Ryan whispered over his shoulder to his wife. No, I'm staying here with you," Sharon slipped into his jacket pitifully. "Come on, honey, come on out to the big guys. Come on, honey. Come out to the big uncles," the fat thug said. "They want to play with you so badly that your husband can hardly get away with it," he laughed. All three of them lunged at her husband. "Ryan," Tora shouted, and Ryan was immediately engaged in a pitched battle with the three ghouls. He began to strike them with his legs and arms, trying to drive the bandits away from him. The man couldn't make a single grab because he risked slowing down too much, which would be a fatal loss for him. Sharon darted to the right, hoping to outrun the razor-wielding thug, but he was nimble and immediately delivered a powerful blow to the woman's stomach. "Where are you going, Otter?" The thug whispered and grabbed Sharon by the hair, pulling her against him. The woman felt first the stench of his breath, then the cold blade against her tender neck. "Ryan," she screamed, and Ryan immediately lost his guard, taking a crushing blow to the jaw and falling to his knees. "No," Sharon shouted in desperation and kicked him in the groin with all her might. Despite the pain in her stomach, she couldn't let the criminals kill her husband. "She's going to fucking kill him in front of her," the lanky guy shouted, and he and the fat guy started kicking Ryan in the stomach and head area. Sharon managed to escape from the fat man's death throes for a second, but he managed to slash her across the chest with a razor. Lowering her head, the girl saw a scarlet rivulet pouring down her light-colored dress. "Come here, you bitch," the villain growled, and with a short thrust, he jammed the weapon right into Sharon's stomach. In an instant, the world around her became one big blurry blur. The pain was so unbearable that Sharon forgot how to breathe as she whispered her husband's name one last time. She collapsed and fell into darkness. Sharon was consciously aware of the squealing of police sirens. Apparently, the restaurant staff had heard the noise in the backyard and called the police. An ambulance came with them, but Sharon didn't see that. She was surrounded on all sides by a clammy, cold darkness. Sharon. Sharon, can you hear me, sweetheart? Is it me, your husband, Ryan? It was with great difficulty that Sharon opened her eyes. Above her was a perfectly white ceiling that at first even blinded the woman with its light. Next to her, she heard a nasty beeping sound. It was her condition being recorded by special medical devices. Sharon felt a long plastic tube inserted into her nose and cool air flowing through it. Then the woman felt someone gently and tenderly squeezing her hand. Ryan, she said very weakly. Is it really you? Are you alive? Leaning over her, her husband's face confirmed it. I'm a tough nut to crack, thank God. You scared me a lot, sweetheart. I thought I'd lost you. It took Sharon exactly half a second to recall the events leading up to her hospital stay. Baby, the young woman exclaimed in a pale voice and immediately pressed her hand to her belly. It was completely flat and tightly bandaged. Our baby. Ryan. What's wrong with him? I asked my wife, anticipating the worst. Instead of answering, the man lowered his eyes and then ruffled his hair in a nervous motion. The doctors fought for your life for so long. They had no choice. There was no saving our baby anyway. I'm so sorry, honey, I'm so sorry. No way. It can't be. Sharon was hysterical. The attending physician came running into the room. What have you done? The elderly surgeon glared angrily at Ryan while trying to hold the convulsing woman. Who gave you permission to tell your patient such news when she was on the verge of death? Leave this room immediately. Nurse, hurry up and get me a sedative. The doctor turned to the nurse, who ran to the nurse at the same moment. It would have been better to say it right away, Ryan said grimly, struggling to rise from his chair. It would have hurt more later. The surgeon looked at him for a moment, then shook his head sternly. I understand you're both in shock, but that didn't give you the right to risk your wife's health like that. Ryan seemed to ignore what the surgeon had said. He looked at the unfolding picture with a sense of utter hopelessness. His beloved had almost died and lost a child, and he, an emergency worker, couldn't prevent it. Sharon, I'll come back tomorrow, his husband said with tears in his eyes and left the room. The hardest part for Sharon was just ahead. After a long and painful recovery, the doctor announced a disappointing verdict. Because of her injuries, she would never be able to have children again. The young woman was absolutely devastated. After arriving home, Sharon could not remember what had happened in those moments around her. All the days merged into one hopelessly gray streak. Ryan tried to somehow reach out to his wife, to bring her out of this comatose state. But it was no use. The parents, as depressed by their daughter's condition as her husband, also tried to talk to Sharon, but she was completely unresponsive. No one but Ryan and her family knew how hard it was for Sharon to get up in the morning every day to get back to at least a semblance of her old self. It wasn't until almost a year later that she was able to consciously perceive her surroundings again. The pain of losing the baby was still too fresh to completely forget the experience. The woman's stomach was now forever imprinted with the marks of that horrific evening. Sharon hid the scars under dark, tight clothing. She could no longer wear a swimsuit or a light summer dress. She kept feeling like strangers would stare at her gruesome cuts. Even with Ryan, she now acted cold and reserved. And by no means did that mean she blamed him for what had happened. But she knew the anguish he must have felt, and she no longer thought their love was appropriate. At least not until the whole story had finally dissolved into the daily routine of life as it went on. To recover and distract herself from the inevitable longing, Sharon went back to work, even though it was unbearably painful to look at other people's children every day. More and more often she found herself thinking that little by little, a little at a time, she was getting better. The pain was slowly receding to the very bottom of her soul, leaving only a calmness bordering on indifference. That had been Sharon's salvation to begin with. And then when she found herself in a state where she had just found stable ground beneath her feet, her whole world fell apart again into tiny pieces from which she could no longer reassemble anything. It had been exactly 3 years ago, the year before Sharon had finally moved to Yale Chio. Ryan had gone on a business trip somewhere up north, to Siberia. There were terrible fires there that year, and Sharon's husband was called together with other emergency workers to extinguish the fire on helicopters by dropping a special extinguishing compound. The worst thing, in what all the time after that Sharon blamed herself, is that she felt exactly nothing. Calmly let her beloved husband, the only person she had ever known, go on that damned business trip. 2 days after Ryan left, she got a call from an unknown number. "Hello," Sharon Clark said, an unfamiliar male voice. "Yes, it's me. Who am I speaking to?" "This is Captain Leo Stone of the emergency response team. Your husband, Ryan Clark." Sharon's heart immediately dropped into her stomach. It made it hard to think, not just to speak. "Yes," the woman said softly. "Sharon, be strong. Your husband died heroically while fighting a fire in the woods." Sharon felt the floor beneath her begin to move slowly away from her. Grasping the edge of the table to keep from falling, The pediatrician interjected. "So how is it dead?" "No, there must be some mistake. He's only been gone 2 days." "I'm sorry," the captain said a little more gently. "Your husband's helicopter got into a difficult situation. One of its blades failed, and then the whole apparatus fell into the river. We found the body of one of the pilots at once, but your husband must have been carried down the river by the current. Our divers are already checking the area." Something inside Sharon twitched weakly. Maybe it was the last strings of her nerves. "Wait, are you saying that Ryan's body hasn't been found yet? Wait, but that could mean he had a chance. Maybe he's still alive. Maybe he's washed ashore somewhere and needs help." There was a sad sigh from the phone. "If only it were that easy," Sharon Leo answered her. "There was a lot of height from which they fell. Plus the damage to the helicopter is such that, in general, if I were you, I would not have any illusions. But our team is doing everything necessary to comb the area as efficiently as possible." Sharon answered the captain coldly and firmly. "Luckily, Captain, you're not in my shoes and you're not likely to ever be. I'll be on the first flight as soon as possible. I want to be personally involved in the search for my husband." "I suppose so, Sharon, but you don't need all this. I promise you," Leo warned her paternally. But the lifeguard's wife was a stubborn person when it came to keeping her family together. "Let me decide for myself what I do and what I don't want to do. Captain, give me the address. I'll be there." Having warned her parents and superiors, the woman went into the heart of the taiga with members of the search and rescue team. Sharon searched the forests, but there was no sign of Ryan. "I told you you'd only be wasting your breath with this," Captain Stone lamented Sharon's arrival. "We haven't accomplished anything anyway," Sharon told the captain. "No," Sharon told him firmly. "My husband will be considered missing until you find his body. Only then will I accept that he's dead. Until then, you must keep searching as long as you can." An exhausted Sharon returned to New York. The search for her husband continued for several more months, but all was in vain. Finally, the woman came to a difficult decision to abandon everything in the capital and move permanently to a remote taiga village. That's exactly what Jilburi turned out to be. "Daughter, think about it," Brenda begged her, depressed by the situation. "I understand your grief over losing Ryan. He'll always be in your heart. But you don't just want to leave your job and your home. You want to leave us?" Sharon's elderly mother was struggling to hold back tears. "Mom, I'm sorry, but this is the only thing I really need right now," the pediatrician explained to her. "I can't stay here anymore. It reminds me of how much he and I had, how much we had in common and how much we lost." Brenda looked at her daughter with an attentive, understanding gaze. "Promise to write to me," at least her mother asked with a pleading tone in her voice. "Of course I will, Mommy," she said, hugging the older woman and assuring her daughter. "I'll write as soon as I get settled in. I'll write right away. I have already agreed with the local hospital. They take me immediately on specialty. Can you imagine? The staff there is very small. Only 10 people. So you don't have to worry about rumors about me." "Oh, honey. Rumors are so infectious," Brenda said, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief. If you don't want to, they'll come out of thin air. You're new to them, so they won't trust you at first. They'll look at you. You just have to be patient, see if you can fit into their way of life. Just write to me, sweetheart, and don't forget your mother and father." Sharon hugged her mother fondly and promised her that she would be all right. The next morning she was already sitting in the airplane carrying her to the distant, uncharted Siberian lands. Sharon had made 3 transfers to Joelbury, 2 of which were by small private helicopter and 1 by an old, half-decayed bus. One thing Sharon kept carefully hidden, even from herself. She hoped to move to the remote taiga and become at least a small microscopic part closer to her missing husband. When Sharon woke up the next morning, after a heavy night of dreams mixed with memories, her head ached so badly that she didn't know where to put herself. After taking 2 painkillers, Sharon made her way to her medical station, hoping that the fresh air and the sense of forest herbs would cheer her up a bit. As soon as she was deep into her paperwork, however, Charlotte Karen, the milkmaid, burst into her office. "Sharon, you've got all the hope in the world," Charlotte said, out of breath. "Charlotte, what's wrong? Calm down, take a breath. Would you like some water?" "I don't have time for this," the blonde waved her hand at her, panting. "Are we going?" Sharon didn't understand. "Kyla, our witch doctor Michelle's granddaughter, is not doing well. I was at their house in the woods the other day." Charlotte circled the space around her uncertainly. "So Kayla was already withering away before my eyes. And this morning her grandmother Michelle told her to call her doctor. Well, my potions aren't working." Sharon had heard something about Michelle, the village witch doctor, an old woman who was rumored to be over 100 years old. She rarely showed up in the village, preferring to buy food and things through the locals. Sharon didn't approve of the women going to the witch doctor, but there was nothing she could do about it. They had been accustomed to consulting the witch since they were little girls. The only thing Sharon hoped was that they would be smart enough not to entrust their lives and the lives of their young children to the witch doctor's potions. Not too long ago, though, there was a rumor in the village that Michelle had a granddaughter. However, no matter how many times Sharon herself tried to get to her to check on the baby, she could not find the old witch's hut in the woods. And Michelle's daughter Pamela flatly refused to see a doctor. She and her grandmother, in principle, as Sharon realized, were against modern technology and medicine. But they brought the child down with their herbs. Sharon exclaimed excitedly and immediately got ready to leave. "Kayla, how old is she?" "She looks like she's just a baby." "About a year old, maybe 2, Charlotte said after a moment's thought. "She's a baby," Sharon said, shaking her head. "Charlotte, can you take me that way or to their house? I keep getting lost whenever I go there." Charlotte looked at the pediatrician strangely, then muttered quietly, "It's strange, children shouldn't go there." She added louder, "Unless Michelle herself didn't give you a pass." "Okay, but follow me. Follow the trail. The terrain there is swampy. It's easy to stumble," the milkmaid replied. In half an hour, the 2 women were already walking in the impenetrable forest. Charlotte walked lightly and briskly, almost flying over the roots and sharp branches that seemed to avoid the villager. For Sharon, however, the journey had become a living hell. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, where the witch's neat hut stood, Sharon felt like a squeezed lemon and scratched from the trees and shrubs. "Here we are," Charlotte said, pointing to the witch doctor's house. "If you will excuse me, I will go home. I have 1,000 chores to do." "Of course you do," Sharon nodded. "Thank you for your help. It's amazing how I couldn't find their house all this time. It didn't seem that far away, but every time I did, it was like I'd lost my way." Charlotte eyed Sharon a little suspiciously. "Why didn't the old witch let her go to her house?" "Maybe she thought it was the right thing to do," she said on the way back. "Maybe she sensed some kind of competition from her." Sharon was a doctor, after all. A real one. Michelle and Pamela never liked doctors. Sharon, left alone, hurried up to the porch of the hut and knocked quietly on the open door. There was no answer. Then she decided to go inside herself without invitation. The atmosphere inside was mystical. It was as if Sharon was visiting Baba Yaga herself. Everywhere hung bundles of various herbs, jars with incomprehensible potions, and a pungent aroma of juniper and spruce needles. The young woman went into the living room, hoping that the sick child was lying here somewhere. The room was rather ascetic: an old oak table, a couple of chairs, kerosene lamps, a chest of drawers, and a couple of framed photographs. One of them showed a certain girl in a dress similar to the ones used for burning the pancake effigy in spring. She stood in an embrace with a very old, wrinkled, like dried olives, woman. Apparently that was who Michelle and her daughter Pamela were. My God, how old is Pamela then, thought to herself an amazed Sharon. If it's true that her mother is 100 years old, then this woman is definitely a witch. She managed to have a baby too. Sharon put the picture back and looked at the second picture. And that's when her inside snapped. "What are you doing here?" came from behind her in a chastening old man's voice. "If it were up to me, you'd be wandering in the swamps like this. Yes, it seems that now the situation is desperate. The taiga itself let you come to me." Sharon slowly turned to the witch doctor, meeting the gaze of her unkind black eyes like the eyes of a raven. Michelle was very petite, less than half Sharon's height, but she looked very determined and a little hostile. "Where did you get that?" Sharon asked, pointing to the second picture, where her Ryan stood with a bushy beard and long hair down. Sure, he'd changed a lot in appearance, more rugged, and his eyes were unkind. But it was definitely him. "You put that back," the old woman said. "It's not yours. It's not worth looking at." Sharon's lips quivered and her knees went weak, as wobbly as when she had tried to escape from the bandit. "I'm not doing anything until you tell me where you got that picture," Sharon almost shouted in the witch doctor's face. The woman tightened her immortal, dry lips a little. Then she answered, "You'd better ask him. Will you see him soon? Did he follow you into town too? We just missed each other. You know, that's your fate." Michelle sighed heavily and then asked with pressure, "So you're going to treat my child or not? What did I call you here for?" Sharon woke up as if from a long sleep. She was trembling inside. "Show me your granddaughter," the doctor nodded and followed her into a small room, the vault of which was even lower than the living room. Here in a tiny crib lay a pale little girl. Only her cheeks burned with an unusually bright blush. "Is that Kayla?" Sharon asked. "Take care of her right away," Michelle replied. "She's been getting worse since the third day. I don't know why my potions aren't working." "Yes, do you realize that your granddaughter has pneumonia?" Sharon asked her loudly, her eyes glittering. "The girl needs to be hospitalized immediately. Thank God Charlotte brought me to you. If you had, you would have lost the baby. Do you realize that?" The witch doctor's face crinkled like she'd taken a bite out of a sour apple. "Don't burn like that, do you understand?" The old woman replied obediently. "No, I'm just wondering where her mother is," Sharon asked, looking angrily at the old woman. "No, you should have let it go like that. All we have to do now is put her on a drip and pray for Kayla to come to her senses," Michelle said. The baby made a faint sound under the pediatrician's hands. "My God, she's burning up," the woman said, and pulled a syringe and a vial of medicine out of her case. "What are you going to inject her with?" Michelle asked, looking at the ampoule incredulously. "I won't let you operate on my granddaughter." And the herbalist blocked Sharon's access to the crib. "Calm down. This is the standard antipyretic used in such cases," Sharon replied, looking confidently into Michelle's eyes. The old woman hesitated, but still stepped back, allowing her granddaughter to be injected. "She should feel better now," Sharon said and looked at the witch doctor. "What are the normal words?" "You know, emergency? I need my granddaughter." "And how do I know what's in your heads, the newcomers?" asked her indignant tone witch doctor. "My adopted daughter went into the woods on the third day and never came back. Maybe it was your co-workers who took her for experiments. My girl, where are you now?" In the next moment, large tears rolled from Michelle's eyes. Sharon realized that the woman was no longer quite sane, and it would be better if she took the girl with her to the hospital. Behind all these thoughts, the pediatrician almost forgot the mysterious photo she saw at the old lady in the living room. However, in the next minute, the solution to this mystery appeared to her in person. "Doctor, is she all right?" Ryan asked with undisguised concern in his voice. I called the elevator, but I almost fainted. I begged her to let me get a real doctor down here. Sharon turned cautiously toward the man, trying not to faint herself. Her lost spouse was standing right in front of her, looking exactly as he had in that photograph. Ryan, she said, pale as a sheet. Sharon, tell me it's true. Are you imagining things? The man stared at her for a moment, uncomprehending. Then a spark of recognition flashed in his eyes, and then he grabbed the door to keep from collapsing to the floor. Memories rained down on his brain like a snowstorm. Bill, what are you doing? Old Michelle looked from Sharon to Ryan and back again. Haven't you ever seen our village doctor? Why not? Is she the one who calls you Ryan? So that was your name in your previous life? Then Michelle scrutinized Sharon, and only after that she said with dislike, so it was you he called then in a fever. And I wondered why I didn't like you so much at once. How did I feel that you were connected? I just didn't realize it was so close that it stretched across the country. Sharon, honey, it's me, Ryan. You're seeing things right, honey. How could I have forgotten? In spite of the distance between them, Ryan took 2 wide strides to his weeping wife and squeezed her in a tight embrace. I knew you were alive, Ryan. I talked to you every night, prayed for you, felt that you hadn't crashed in the helicopter. But who did? What do you care about Michelle and Pamela? And how did you end up here? Her husband looked at her with anxiety, but with boundless love, then said, I will tell you everything for sure. Only please, let's first take my daughter to the hospital. I'm very worried about her condition. Daughter? Sharon said in amazement and pulled away from Ryan. Pamela had a baby with you? There was a moment of tense silence between the couple, but then Sharon managed to pull herself together and said, somewhat dryly, yes, you're right, the child's life comes first. Taking the girl in his arms, the man hurried out of the hut. He easily led Sharon out of the woods and back to the village and carried his daughter directly to the hospital. When Kayla had been given all the help she needed and Sharon was sure that the little girl's life was no longer in danger, she sank tiredly onto the small couch in her office. We can talk, Ryan said softly as he walked in. Sharon looked up at him, her eyes red with worry and tears. Do we have anything else to talk about? She asked in a colorless voice. The man walked carefully into the office and locked the door behind him. Sharon, I have so much to tell you, he began. But before I do, I want to assure you that if I could remember a single day of our life together, I would have come straight back to New York, I promise you. The woman smiled sadly in return. I guess you had such a good time here that you didn't even have to remember anything. Nothing stirred in your soul while you were hiding with those forest witches. Her husband grabbed her hands and forced her to face him. No, Sharon, you've got it all wrong. I just couldn't remember anything. You know I couldn't. And Ryan began his sad story. I was blown into the river by a shockwave. I don't really remember how it happened. I just felt a strong jolt and a few seconds of free fall, and then cold and pain, when Michelle found me on the shore. I was badly mangled and unconscious. She and her daughter Pamela managed to drag me to her hut, and there, the man sighed nervously. There I spent the next 6 months, barely regaining consciousness. Those women cured me, no matter what anyone says. Some of their potions have incredible healing powers. I don't know, maybe it was something like a coma, except when I finally woke up, I was a blank slate, you know? I didn't even remember my name, didn't know who I was. Ryan rubbed the bridge of his nose, as if he wanted to erase from his memory all the terrible things that had happened to him. Sharon listened without interrupting. She wanted to know the whole truth from him, all the way to the end. I've been relearning how to walk. There's something wrong with my back, because I can't always keep my balance. But that's okay as long as you don't try to run too fast or carry too heavy a load. Pamela has been with me from the beginning. She nursed me, spoon-fed me. She brought me back to life. I'm sorry, but it's true. A bitter grin appeared on Sharon's face. How touching. The woman silently admitted to herself that she was overcome with jealousy. And then I started walking again solely because I had completely lost my memory. I decided to stay here for a while until I remembered who I was, and if I had a family. Naturally, I helped the women with their chores and hunted. But I did all that without leaving the woods, you know. Michelle led me to believe that I might be a fugitive. And then the police station would probably have an APB out on me. Ryan tried to explain to his wife. There was Sharon responded resignedly. Only the APB had you listed as a missing person. Sharon covered her face with her hands, unable to take in all this information. God, I've been looking for you for so long. I'm alive, Ryan replied firmly. I'm alive and I'm sitting here trying to explain everything to you. How do you explain your daughter? His wife brought him to the point. Ryan looked off into the distance, and for a moment he was transported into his own thoughts. I love Kyla very much, and I want to take her with me when this is over and she's fully recovered. It was a moment of weakness. Sharon, you have to understand, I didn't remember anything at all, and Michelle was so good to me. When she told me she was pregnant, I knew that whatever happened, I would take care of my daughter. His spouse turned away. She didn't want Ryan to see her face right now. Except Pamela was gone. Karen? The woman didn't understand. Pamela's gone. Remember when Michelle said she'd gone into the woods and hadn't been home in 3 days? Well, I found her today. What's wrong with her? Sharon whispered with a bad feeling. She's dead, Ryan replied shortly. Oh my God, Sharon exclaimed, clamping her hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. How did this happen? Her husband rubbed his palms, sweating with fear. Sharon had never seen him so frightened. I guess she went to pick herbs and berries. So, anyway, it was a bear. I only recognized her by her dress, her basket. Sharon felt her feet go cold. Michelle, are you going? Ryan only shook his head. I suspected she'd already figured it out. She'd rather think her daughter drowned in the swamp than have me tell her such a terrible truth. They have a slightly different concept of death here. I buried Sabrina there, in the forest, so Michelle, God willing, will not stumble upon her. The taiga gives and takes back. Michelle said she found Sabrina as a lonely teenager. She was supposedly hiding in the woods from her stepfather. So she took her in. You don't regret her? She was a really nice person, Ryan said quietly. What can I do now that I found out about her like that? Sharon felt shame burning inside her. Alas, it was only after the news of Pamela's death that she had been able to see her as the person who had saved her husband's life, not as an insidious rival. Sharon? Ryan asked her quietly. Can we get out of here as soon as Kayla's better? We will. You can forgive me, right? Sharon looked into her husband's blue eyes and made the only decision she could make. Of course, Ryan. I'm still your wife, and I'll always be your wife. And so it was. As soon as little Kayla recovered, Ryan and Sharon quickly packed for the road and were ready to take a bus that evening to the nearest airport, where they could be flown to the mainland by helicopter. And then they could take a regular airplane to New York City. Ryan wanted to go to say goodbye to Susan as he was stunned by Charlotte's tragic news. It turns out that the old healer was gone the night before. Apparently could not survive the disappearance of her daughter, suggested the milkmaid then, and no one knew exactly how old Michelle was. Sharon even wept when she learned of the old woman's death. No matter how she felt about her and her unconventional methods of treatment, she never wished her a similar fate. Don't worry, Charlotte assured her. We'll give her a proper Christian burial. The pediatrician thanked the kind countrywoman and, after saying goodbye to everyone except Vincent's annoying paramedic, left with her husband and Kayla back to the capital. When they returned home, the first thing they did was to officially adopt little Kayla and restore all of Ryan's papers. Sharon's parents were happy to learn that their son-in-law was alive after all. They threw a big party for the occasion, and Kayla became the long-awaited granddaughter who came to them almost 10 years after their daughter's wedding. Ryan went back to work and rescue, but due to an injury he could no longer work in the field. so he went back to where he once started. He now counsels and trains young lifeguards. Now he is full of strength and energy, and wants to make his life more calm and measured, directing most of his time to raising his daughter and his beloved wife. Sharon, on the other hand, continued her work at the clinic. Returning to her former duties, she, as before, treats children. Only now she has her own little daughter waiting for her at home, whom she loves more than life, and for whom she thanks God every day. So, having gone through a series of difficult trials, the Clark family finally found a second chance for happiness. And this time they are not going to miss it. Barbara worked as an editor at a publishing house. On another Thursday, just before lunchtime, her smartphone started ringing. On the screen she saw the words "Mom," although calls during work were not a frequent occurrence. Barbara didn't expect anything bad. She figured her mom just missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Barbara answered the phone. As soon as she heard her mom's voice, she immediately knew something was wrong. The voice was strange, muffled. "Barbara, honey, don't worry, please," Mom said. "I'm at the hospital right now." "Mommy, what happened? What hospital are you in? What did the doctors say? What do you need to bring? What's the room number?" Barbara asked her questions. "Barbara, please don't worry," the voice answered. "It's just like in the movie. I slipped and fell and was passed out. But I'm fine." Gabriella, a neighbor, was walking by. She helped me and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'd be fine, but I'd be in the hospital for a while. "Mom, why didn't you tell me before? Mom, why didn't you tell me? I would have rushed to help. I didn't want to interrupt you in the middle of the day. Mom, but tonight 4 to 7 p.m. is visiting hours. I was afraid if you went home first, then to the pharmacy, you might not make it. Please write down what you need to bring. The main things are a policy, a cell phone charger, and non-carbonated water. For some reason, I'm very thirsty." Her mother sighed, and Barbara imagined her face contorted with pain. She hurried to end the conversation by asking for the number of the hospital and the room. Barbara reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her. Yes, Barbara had peed chicken broth in it and used wet wipes. And on wobbly legs, she went to ask her boss, Jack. "Please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. My mom's in the hospital," Barbara said. The boss, a friend of Barbara's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy. When he learned which hospital the subordinate's mother was in, he cheered her up and asked, "But the doctors at our regional clinic are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff are top-notch. I've been in this hospital several times. I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. By the way, are you driving today, or is Matthew driving? Maybe Eden can give you a ride in the car." Barbara was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Jack. That would be very helpful. I'm not keeping the driver long. I just need to get to my mom's house, that's all. I won't keep Eden any longer. I'll get my things there and then call a cab. Thank you." The manager wished Barbara success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Eden to wait for you at your mother's house and give you a ride to your family home. He's coming back for me anyway. Is your house on the way?" Thanking her sensitive boss again, Barbara went to turn off her computer and clean up her workplace. She took the contract with her so that she wouldn't let the whole team down and complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman badly perceived the meaning of the jokes with which the driver tried to entertain her. But even she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react somehow and prevented her from sinking into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item with a check mark, Barbara packed up her mother's apartment, watering her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to make sure there were no perishables in the refrigerator, picked up the trash to throw out. Only then did Barbara go downstairs and set off with her driver, Eden. Not far from Barbara and Matthew's house was a supermarket with a pharmacy department inside. The woman decided to stop there on the way, asking Eden to pull over near the container yard. She threw out the garbage she had collected and rushed to get her groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Barbara bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, she called Matthew and explained the situation. "Matthew, Mom is in the hospital. I'm going to go see her. I'm not sure how long she'll be there. Dinner will be on the stove." My husband replied, "I'm aware of that. Jack told me you needed support. You wait for me, I'll try to get there early, and we'll go to the hospital together. See if there's anything else you need, and I'll be there for you." Matthew didn't let his wife down and took her and the 2 bags she had packed and drove her to the hospital. Barbara managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mother and the doctor, who was fortunately there. Matthew remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave her kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery. Audrey tried to smile when she saw Barbara enter the room, but it was noticeable that she was uncomfortable and frightened. Barbara said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bedside. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg. Her lips, swollen almost to the point of bleeding, were a clear indication that the victim of the ice had been in great pain. Barbara listened to her mother's account of her accident and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the nightstand. The phone was immediately put on charge. She gave her mother tea with jam, broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. "The internet says that such a salad in the first days after injury the best vitamin remedy. Then I'll give you some sauerkraut. It's good for you, too," Barbara said. "Oh, don't worry, my daughter. You should probably go home, Matthew. He's probably worried you're gone," Audrey said. Barbara explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened so she wouldn't have to take a cab, but he hadn't been missed. But he said hello, as if he'd just been waiting for that line. The woman lying in the next bed became active. "Sanitarians, nurses here are rude, boorish women. And you interfere in the conversation. It is impossible to call them neither day nor night. They serve teas, make fun of doctors, give chocolates. Even giving them money is useless. They're not even doing their job properly anyway." Barbara kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor also made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room, look there, probably with someone cooing keen. Thanking the nagging woman dryly, Barbara went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly. "Patrick is now in the superintendent's office, the penultimate door at that end of the corridor. Wait there. Or you can sit on the bench near the residence room." Barbara waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Audrey's daughter. He invited her into the office, showing her the picture on the computer screen. "If I may say so, your mother's fracture was a success," Patrick explained. "In general, there are 2 treatment options." The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which one did you decide on?" Barbara looked the doctor in the eyes, but did not answer, but asked a counter question. "Say, Patrick, for example, if a patient with the same fracture as my mom had a loved one, what would you recommend?" Smiling, the doctor replied briefly, "A similar case was with my aunt. Our superintendent performed a similar operation on her a year ago, and as she now leads an active life, even works at the cottage, so I cannot keep up with her." The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming surgery, wrote down what else should be brought for the postoperative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Barbara had to announce to her mother that the surgery was scheduled for the next day, and she presented the news as lightly as possible, trying not to disturb her mother. "Tomorrow I'll go and meet you. You'll be fine after the operation, don't worry." "Barbara, what about your job?" "The boss is probably going to be mad," Audrey asked. "Don't worry about that. I'll do all the work and I won't let you or the chief down." With the surgery, the long road to getting Audrey walking again had just begun. For 2 weeks, Barbara visited her mother almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Barbara, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I have no appetite." Where would it come from if my energy is not used for anything? But Audrey couldn't change her daughter's mind. When the day of discharge arrived, Barbara went to the doctor's office for recommendations. Patrick was cautious and warned. Your mom is a very energetic lady, but I've made my point, and I'll make it to you again. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you. But there's no need to despair, although you can't use your injured limb for full weight bearing. Crutches are your mom's best friend for the next month. And then you have to be careful too. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatments are indicated to prevent bed sores. In 6 weeks, I'll be waiting for a follow-up X-ray. We'll see what stage of fusion the bone will be in. That's pretty much it. Barbara asked. Maybe some vitamins for Mom to take? Patrick shrugged. Well, in principle you could, but in general you should be told about the rehabilitation plan at the polyclinic where you live. Barbara called a special cab specializing in the transportation of people with limited mobility, and after a heroic trek through the streets, Audrey was finally in her apartment. Barbara faced a new problem. Audrey's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the restroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. At first, Barbara came to Audrey's house twice a day, and closer to the New Year's holidays, she was practically exhausted. The traffic jams were so time-consuming that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Barbara turned to her husband. Matthew, let's let Mom stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between apartments. The man answered grimly, and after a quick pause, Barbara, I feel wonderful about your mother. Audrey is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry. But I'm going to be blunt, we have nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio apartment. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I talked you into taking out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mom were against it. Matthew, there's got to be some kind of a screen. It'd be like having 2 rooms. Look, but Audrey would be the first thing that would be uncomfortable. I play computer games loudly. I listen to music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mom is very tactful and wise and realizes that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be. Matthew turns out to be right. Audrey, having barely heard the idea of moving into her son-in-law and daughter's apartment, only exclaimed indignantly, "There can't even be a conversation. At home and the walls help. I will not go to your place, especially there, and it will be inconvenient to be sick in peace." Barbara obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic and left the place of a lawyer in Jack's firm. With the permission of her boss, Barbara transferred to a half-time position and was very glad that the manager was able to meet her needs. She prepared the contracts during the visit and trained her smart girl, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. The rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. And then Matthew would grumble. "Look, Barbara, your mother must have some free medication." The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget did not suffer, and money from her husband for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles, she did not ask. Barbara had generally tried to handle the situation on her own, without Matthew's interference. The weather was changing. Barbara's schedule remained almost unchanged by the tradition that had formed. In the morning she would make her husband breakfast and, if she had time, make preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she would rush to her mother's house, stopping at stores and pharmacies along the way. Taking care of her, keeping her spirits up and helping her move around the apartment took a lot of time. Barbara would then run to the office and rush home by evening in case of any emergencies. Her neighbor, the same Gabriella who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's apartment. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together, so Audrey couldn't be called abandoned. But Barbara was desperate to get her mom back on her feet, and not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling between very distant parts of the city every day, without weekends and holidays. It was just that Mom was the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Barbara life twice. The first time was on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later when a terrible tragedy struck Barbara in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helped her to move around when her legs almost collapsed due to nervousness, forced her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then by force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty work, my mother sold the apartment in their hometown and, almost as a huge and clumsy cule, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Barbara reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Audrey who had forced her to take a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Barbara did not consider her help to her mother as self-sacrifice and, despite her fatigue, tried to surround her husband with care. Moreover, the 10-year wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to organize a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Matthew. She made a preliminary version of the menu in advance. She found a confectionery where orders were made on individual designs and agreed to prepare an unusual figurative cake for her husband. "I love his sweets," Barbara said. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Matthew, during his morning breakfast, warned, "Sorry, Barbara, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch office in the neighboring region because something seems to be going on there with the branch manager's reports. Profits are down by leaps and bounds. Although in other divisions everything is even. And in some places even growth is observed. Of course I'll try to make a quick trip, but airplanes are unlikely to fly in those parts. And I don't feel like taking the train. Can you manage without a car?" Although Barbara herself was counting on the faithful family horse, she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Matthew thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "Nothing, we'll buy you an iron horse a little later. The situation at work will normalize, and you'll choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there Friday night." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Barbara moved to her mother's house for a while so as not to waste time on the road. During these few days she had time to do a general cleaning, and the apartment was somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday Barbara had to return home. To bring to the office, she urgently needed a diploma. However, it was even better, because she had to clean up the house and prepare some of Matthew's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the holiday treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the elevator repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside so she could rejoice in the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Audrey and Barbara had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mommy, you'll have to excuse me, please. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Matthew. Turn off the TV when you get bored. Your cell phone's charged. Call me if you need anything, okay?" "Run, Barbara. Happy holidays and cheers." Wow, 10 years together. She kissed her mom and Barbara ran along the route she'd planned. Spring, which had long ago entered its rights and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart aroma of blossoming lilac set the mood for the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that marriage in May portended trouble, she did not have to suffer in her second marriage. On the contrary, Matthew was for a woman a safe haven. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Barbara appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not pester her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he announced his serious intentions that Barbara warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Matthew asked if she had changed her mind about the child. But having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength her wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Barbara bought drinks, picked up the calamari Matthew adored. And so she bought little things: a crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Barbara had thoughtfully brought with her were gradually filling up. Having hung them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered a cake. Now it was time to go home. As she approached the driveway, Barbara looked hopefully at the family parking space and breathed a sigh of relief there was no car. So she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. Praising herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free, the woman hurriedly opened the door and finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box with the cake on the banquet, Barbara suddenly froze with surprise. The familiar hum of a residential apartment building was brazenly interfered with by a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat. There were no foreign things visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly, as if someone had moved a massive plate or a bulky mug. Matthew and Barbara kept no pets. All they wanted was a cute dog. An unfortunate accident with their mom had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband. But from fatigue, Barbara didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her sneakers off her feet, and with her bag squarely on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed with surprise, tucking one leg under her. On a chair sat a boy of about 6 years of age. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Matthew's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Barbara had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it would have time to soak. A spoon sticking out from the edge clearly indicated that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child bit into the stick of cheese and smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart clenched as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Barbara even thought she was hallucinating because of overwork or some other reason. However, the sight, the sound, the image, and even the aroma of the sausage were too realistic. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Barbara, in a voice a little hoarse from nervous shock, caught his attention with a question. "Hello, who are you? And what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage, reported. "My name is Roger. Uncle Matthew brought me here. Told him to wait here. Said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Barbara had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Matthew wasn't her husband. There was no such incredible coincidence as in a traditional New Year's Eve movie, when the hero didn't realize he'd opened someone else's apartment with his own keys, and was completely unconcerned by the typical furnishings of a standard apartment. Barbara could safely vouch for the fact that it wasn't easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's place. Surely there must be a logical explanation for the boy's appearance in the kitchen, the woman thought. She herself, having married Matthew, had become Davies, and Roger's last name meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was the only child of his parents, but he had cousins, as far as Barbara knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them by face or surname. So it was quite possible that the Roger sitting before her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why had he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their apartment? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Barbara couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she hadn't even had time to think of any plausible version when Matthew called. Coming out of her daze, Barbara finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Love, you and I just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Audrey's apartment, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. Set the table." Okay, the confused woman cheered up a little and replied briefly. She felt Roger's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought from the hallway her new slippers, just recently purchased in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Roger, you have sneakers. It's hot at home. Keep your flip-flops. Put them on. It will be more comfortable and convenient." The child silently obeyed. To defuse the situation and occupy the boy thrown to her, but at the same time to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Barbara asked, "Roger, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room and brought the child a whole package of balloons. Then, obeying some impulse, she licked the tips through which Roger was to inflate the balloons and handed them to him, asking, "Don't inflate too much. When you get tired, rest, and I'll help you tie them. Deal?" The child nodded dutifully and, without feeling any embarrassment, asked, "And what's your name?" "Barbara." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, was busy with the marbles. Barbara kept an eye on her guest and began to sort through the bags, prepare what was planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the refrigerator and, distracted by tying the inflated balloons, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but her mind was spinning incessantly with all sorts of thoughts. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other, but hardly spoke to each other. Barbara did not notice how Matthew came into the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Barbara, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see that you and Roger have already made friends. That's wonderful. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy was visibly cheerful, and after Matthew appeared, he said modestly, "Congratulations." And when everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he boasted loudly, "Uncle Matthew, I inflated the balloons myself and Barbara helped me tie them. That's a nice surprise we got for you." The grown man mumbled something inaudible in response, praising Roger and his wife, who hadn't even touched the food. There was tension in the apartment, and Matthew set about remedying the situation. He softly turned on the music and began to enthusiastically praise the dishes his wife had prepared. Then he made a toast to Barbara's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations. I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child to the apartment, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Barbara, clutching the unopened box in the palm of her hand, took out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the package to her husband and confined herself to a parsimonious phrase, "In honor of your wedding anniversary." Matthew hastily tore the wrapping paper, marveled at the pewter mug, and began to show the gift to Roger. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts, not at all how she had envisioned the wedding anniversary celebration. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not only to surprise her, but to throw her completely off balance in the most natural way. Barbara coughed violently from surprise, choking on her mineral water, when she heard the question addressed to her. "Barbara, Roger's going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Matthew said. Barbara was silent, not knowing what to say. Matthew tried to justify himself. "I stopped by Audrey's to pick you up on my way home. I wanted to explain everything to you, but I didn't have time. It was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I was sure that I would pick you up at your mom's and tell you on the way that we had a guest." Matthew's monologue ended in a long silence. Barbara moved the food on her plate with her fork without looking up at her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Roger broke into the silence by asking, "Aunt Barbara, thank you. I've already eaten. Can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face, Barbara got up from the chair and went to the refrigerator. She wanted to scream, stomp her feet, and sob. Her faith in her husband's honesty was shaken. But she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Matthew's bringing Roger to the apartment seemed to be that he had been unfaithful. With all her being, Barbara now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Matthew, who knew his wife well, guessed from her impulsive movements that she would say what was on her mind. So he decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious adult conversation. "Roger, come on, I'll turn on the game console. True, my games are mostly complex, but we can find something to your taste on the internet, or cartoons if you want." "Are you allowed to eat cake there?" asked the boy. "Of course you can eat anything," Matthew said. The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the apartment to the cozy, soft corner. Barbara, having heard the conversation between her husband and the guest, cut a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, turned on the electric kettle, and carefully watched it boil. The click of the kettle turning off brought Barbara out of her reverie. She was making tea. The woman placed a cup of the delicious beverage, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, then carried it to a table near the play area of the apartment. Matthew was showing Roger a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked. "Thank you very much." Barbara nodded and turned and walked away. When Matthew came into the kitchen, he found Barbara sitting on the floor, holding a pair of children's sneakers. Tears were rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Barbara, what's wrong with you?" A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "Now, robot vacuum cleaner, turn on, let him work." "It's no big deal. It's nothing. Why get upset over a little dust? Especially since it's a holiday." Barbara looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Matthew, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. There must have been good reasons for what you did, or, as you put it, for the surprise. And you're understandable. But I'm sorry, I don't have the slightest desire to deal with any of this today. I'm going to go to my mother's and stay with her for a while." Matthew could not understand the reason for such a categorical decision of his wife, but he saw that Barbara was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he suggested, "Barbara, I'm really very guilty for not warning you, but I can explain everything. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I couldn't have done anything differently. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." Suddenly, the woman gently put down the children's sneakers, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and went to the door, as if she hadn't heard her husband. Matthew took his wife's hand and asked, "Barbara, wait a minute. I'll call a cab to Audrey's house so I don't have to worry about you." Barbara nodded and was soon in the cab car. She was holding her purse in her hands. The road was clear, and it took much less time to get to her mom's house than it did during peak hours. As soon as the woman opened the door, she heard, "Gabriella, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Barbara closed the door behind her and went straight into her mother's bedroom. Audrey was alarmed to see her daughter. "Barbara, what are you doing back? Didn't Matthew come home? By my reckoning, your wedding anniversary celebration should be in full swing. And you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Barbara walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head against Audrey's palm and told her everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Roger there. When she had finished her story, Barbara made her suggestion. "Mom, I'm pretty sure Roger is Matthew's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old. So my husband cheated on me and had the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Audrey tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Matthew can explain everything. I can feel that he loves you. Believe my experience, he would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." Barbara, however, cried without stopping. Audrey stroked her so mature but defenseless daughter, but no more words were spoken because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears dried up, Barbara silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Barbara confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and I don't mind lying down." Audrey did not object and suggested, for example, to talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unhappy daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Barbara, but let's get you and me something to calm you down." "Of course, Barbara. Valerian, at least. It would do you and me good." Barbara complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when the clock read 10. She jumped up on the couch and rushed to the kitchen, where she caught Audrey's mother preparing the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time. Are we having breakfast now?" The women made pancakes in 4 hands and, as if they were in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Barbara was washing the dishes, Audrey asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Gabriella. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats in the parlor. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together. And then, as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Gabriella company. Some of them are called away on country plots, some are on a business trip. So the ticket's gone. It's a shame. Barbara shook her head. Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm not in the mood. However, if Audrey had something on her mind, she knew how to insist on her own. That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at switching thoughts in your head and changing emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me. I want to. Barbara had to comply with her mother's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdresser beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Gabriella to take Barbara away, Audrey called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Matthew, Barbara won't be here until about 3 p.m. Come over, we need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned. "Audrey, I'll be there, but I don't have anyone to leave Roger with. I don't think I can find a nanny, but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Me? Great. Then Roger and I will be at your place in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Audrey, carefully reaching the door leaning on a walker, let Matthew and Roger into the apartment. The man introduced the child and the boy Roger said a polite hello. Mistress Audrey tried not to betray her incredible excitement and hospitably invited Roger into the kitchen. "Come in. I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that he tastes most delicious coffee, but it is not allowed for children to drink this drink often, and he will drink tea because he is too old for cocoa. Audrey almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Matthew, asked, "Can we give Roger some tea too?" And she was more like a treat. It's almost like coffee. The boy rejoiced. "I want to try this drink. Matthew, may I?" And Matthew said yes. As the hostess deftly prepared the treat for Roger, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to talk to Audrey. You, please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some videos on the internet for a bit." "Good, sure, where there are words. I'm perfectly capable of being unsupervised, don't worry." Observing this picture, Audrey could barely restrain herself from crying. Hiding her emotions, she slowly walked toward the room, which was old-fashionedly called the hall. Matthew followed her, eager to find out what Audrey wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in an armchair, and the man sat on a sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not endure long and asked without preamble, "Audrey, will you explain to me why Barbara reacted so inadequately to Roger's appearance in our apartment? Will I admit my guilt if anything I did not warn her? But we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt the indignant speech of her son-in-law, but his question was not in a hurry to answer, and asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter to keep the family, I need to be sure that it makes sense. Tell me the truth, Matthew. Is Roger your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course not. I've never thought of cheating on Barbara. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is starting to scare me. Roger was in our apartment because of a desperate situation, but Barbara didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Matthew's answer calmed the worried Audrey, and taking a deep breath, as if preparing to make a parachute jump, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "What is it?" "All things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Barbara grew up a wonderful and clever girl, and was a real joy for me and my husband. We had no problem to arrange her to study in one of the best gymnasiums in our city. The income of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Barbara to be her own among the same, as they say, golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff, and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Barbara was one of the best students in the class. She was even made a tutor for her desk mate Frank. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. His dad was a district attorney, and his mom was in the same department in the last position. In general, they lived better than our family, but they didn't hinder the development of their son's friendship with Barbara. They welcomed her wholeheartedly. They did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Barbara was in 10th grade, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken, according to the autopsy. It was Frank's family that supported Barbara and me after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Barbara decided to marry Frank. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously, you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Frank's parents didn't mind either and were even happy to have my daughter as part of their family. A year after the wedding, Barbara and Frank had twins, 2 boys, Adam and Henry. Healthy, cheerful, and strong, they grew up and made us all happy. Barbara couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Matthew, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the stroller in front of her, and her heart was ready to jump out of her chest every now and then. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My mother-in-law repeatedly suggested that Barbara hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time and mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she did not give up her university studies, and even without a sabbatical leave managed to do without. And her father-in-law put her in a prestigious and well-paid job in such a position that the working day was strictly rationed. There was a social package and other benefits. He had the opportunity, of course. And he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Barbara was smart. When the boys were 6, my daughter became pregnant again. Frank welcomed the news with joy, and why should he? It was a wonderful family relationship. As far as I know, there's never been a fight between them. It was like the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as a whole. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some of the ladies tried to have an affair with Frank, but he didn't want anyone but my daughter. Everything was so perfect, I never thought it would all come crashing down overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Barbara, of course, had to see a doctor, and Frank volunteered to pick up his sons from daycare. By a ridiculous coincidence, his car broke down that day, and he decided not to call a cab, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was beautiful, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys were eager to go to. Frank met a buddy on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids scattered. They ran out onto the lake, but the march ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses later told me, didn't even have time to scream. They went under in a flash. Frank and his buddy rushed to the pond. But no luck. Only the divers who arrived at the scene of the tragedy managed to catch the boys. Frank later tried to justify himself, like a clockwork, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds. What's the use? Our boys had drowned. There was no fixing it. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news because he was afraid for Barbara, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Barbara was at the time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the hallway, Barbara must have realized everything by the look on my face. She was hysterical after hearing the news. Barbara could not be calmed down, even with a large dose of medication. She never went home that night. She ended up in the hospital with a nervous breakdown. My daughter was worried about her dead sons and was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. The doctors didn't even consider him a baby yet, and she had already lost him. At Adam and Henry's funeral, Barbara stood like a stone statue. No tears, no emotion. Pale as death. Especially frightening was the emptiness in her eyes. Frank was no less worried. In his 25 years, he tried to take Barbara's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the apartment where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Frank had tried to talk to her I couldn't count. Only it never worked. Barbara just cut her husband out of her life. Frank's mom came to us when she realized my daughter didn't want to see or hear from her husband. She was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying he wasn't himself. I shared my sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world. But Barbara didn't react. She could never forgive her husband for the death of her sons. Frank could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Barbara predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own accord. But in fact, everyone realized that she simply could not be under everyone's scrutiny. To make matters worse, an unusual and unexpected problem had arisen. The daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She would change her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Barbara and I were riding in the elevator, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed fine, but I wasn't too happy. After the neighbor got off the elevator, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. So hard she bit her lip trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. Even a special doctor, the best of the best, I called home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had developed an obsession, and the medications prescribed by the doctor couldn't handle it for long. Barbara would take the pills for a few hours, become apathetic. Then she'd start thinking about something, pacing the room from side to side. Once I saw that she was looking for poison options on the net, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to be there all the time, to keep an eye on my daughter, so she wouldn't do anything irreparable. One morning, Barbara managed to leave the house while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught up with Frank after his work and attacked him with her fists. She was yelling, "Why are you living here? Why don't our sons? I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated." But supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from a distraught Frank. He didn't even fight back. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where the aroma of the hated Corvalol and some other drugs was wafting. She was almost unresponsive to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Barbara. Among acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk about the accident with my grandchildren, and that Barbara was going crazy with grief. One day, Frank's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I was thinking of ways to hide my daughter from memories, sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my apartment, again thanks to my son-in-law's parents. I managed to do it quickly, and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Barbara and Frank were divorced in absentia, again thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything. And then you know the rest, Matthew. You met her and my daughter started to come back to life. Don't think Barbara still hates it. She's just still in pain. She even refuses the opportunity to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Audrey was silent. Telling her daughter's terrible story, the woman was mentally exhausted. Matthew noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Roger was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, refilled his glass, and returned to Audrey in the hall. "Sorry, what made you remember everything?" he asked. The woman drank the water carefully and spoke bitterly. "Ah, Matthew, if only it could be forgotten. I probably should have told you about Barbara's past sooner. I've been hesitant to tell you. My daughter still can't talk about it either, I understand." The man looked at the woman puzzled and confessed. "To be honest, I had no idea that Barbara's reluctance to become a mom could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't even imagine how she felt when she saw Roger in our kitchen. What a surprise to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Barbara and make her understand?" I really didn't have anywhere to bring Roger, the man continued. And the boy, for a number of reasons. I had to be sheltered for a week or two in a comfortable and safe place where his parents' enemies would have no reason to look. It all came about almost by accident. I arrived at the branch and ran into an old friend on the street whom I hadn't seen since my discharge. Hugh is more than a friend. He's the only reason I survived the army. But it's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but no luck. I guess I should have been more persistent. Then I would have found him, and then I got busy building my career. Anyway, I hadn't seen him in 15 years, and now I meet Hugh in a city that's foreign to both of us. I know he's changed over the years, but I recognized him immediately. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out Hugh had come to solve his sister's and her husband's problems. They were embroiled in a lawsuit with some inadequate people who were used to dealing with things in a criminal way. Roger, of course, is just a perfect boy. He got to know his way around in a strange place. He even went to bed by himself, having brushed his teeth beforehand. Hugh was most worried about Roger, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him the bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor. But they couldn't think of any safe place. And that's where I came in. To Hugh, the idea of taking Roger out of town seemed the ideal. Indeed, there were practically no clues that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was a good thing that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Hugh told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news calmly. I picked him up like a detective, so as not to get caught on the city's CCTV cameras. We agreed to contact Hugh in a week, and he's supposed to call me when it's resolved. Roger and I are very easy to talk to, but I have to work on Monday, and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now, the man said. Matthew was silent. Suddenly, he and Audrey heard Barbara's voice. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual. I'll stay with Roger, only on the condition that the boy didn't have to take public transportation himself. It turned out that, contrary to Audrey's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Barbara explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized that I couldn't go back and stare at the stage without even trying to understand the story. I texted Gabriella to apologize and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Roger's story from the outside because, Matthew, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating. And I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. Today I can look at the situation more rationally. Mom, you don't mind if I visit with Roger, do you? Barbara asked. Audrey, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude toward her children, spoke very carefully. Of course, come. Audrey wanted to say something else, but tears came to her eyes and she decided to change the subject. Barbara. Matthew, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see if Roger's having a good time. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. When the boy saw Barbara, he remembered to say hello. The woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Matthew, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy by telling him what she had faced. Barbara gently but insistently dismissed Audrey's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mom, for everything, but we should probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow afternoon, she said. Matthew, realizing that he had received his wife's forgiveness, was very happy and bid Audrey a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll visit you all tomorrow. If you are feeling well and the weather is warm, we can go to the countryside. How would you like that, Audrey?" That's a wonderful idea, Matthew. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, the woman said. After saying goodbye to the hostess, Barbara, Matthew, and Roger drove to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel, and in the mirror he could see his wife carefully fastening the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Barbara it was a completely natural gesture, brought once to automaticity. She was obviously a reverent, caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after the tragedy that had befallen her, she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish. Matthew carefully parked the car in the driveway. The man carried Roger, who had drowned, to the apartment. Barbara laid him on the couch, spreading the crumpled sheet, carefully removed the boy's shoes and covered him with a blanket. Watching his wife, Matthew felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality, and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Barbara, I'm a real idiot. I almost ruined everything by my actions, and I want to say thank you very much for understanding." His wife smiled. "Well, to be honest, I overreacted too, so I suggest we forget it. Forget it." The weekend passed cheerfully, and even better than the spouses expected. They managed to get Audrey out for a walk, who was much less happy about the sunny May day than she was about her daughter's happy eyes. Barbara was happy to answer Roger's questions and to keep an eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared to reproach her for her hyper-opaque behavior. Roger did not seem to mind at all that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Barbara, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt, and he seemed quite pleased with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Audrey home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, however. Late in the afternoon, as Barbara was putting Roger to bed, the boy asked her quietly, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Barbara replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The reassured boy fell asleep. Barbara, fearful of waking the child, called her husband into the kitchen and began to question him about the story Roger's parents were involved in. "Barbara, I honestly don't even know all the details of that evening. My husband told me everything very briefly. But I realized that his sister and her husband were really attacked by some scumbags." The woman began to ask questions that surprised her husband. "These bandits are from the town you went to, or are they newcomers? Did they call each other anything? Did they have nicknames?" Matthew told everything he knew. But it was not enough for Barbara, and she suddenly asked, "Can't you get in touch with Hugh urgently? I need to get some clarifications from him to try to help Roger's parents. Of course, he's not bad and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mother and son are separated for long." It was impossible to guess from Barbara's voice how closely she took Roger and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Matthew realized how difficult it was for her. "In fact, Hugh gave me a password to a chat room that automatically deletes all messages. I think we can try to contact him." The man opened the necessary site, entered the data that he had learned by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked. See, he welcomed me." Barbara thoughtfully advised, "Matthew, ask him a question that you can tell if he's talking to you. And if there's even the slightest doubt, close the site immediately and pull the SIM card out of the phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Matthew quickly typed a few phrases and waited impatiently for a reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled a sigh of relief. "It's okay. It's definitely Hugh," he answered with our code phrase. Barbara nodded and asked, "Okay, text Hugh that your wife will be texting him now. And give me the phone number. I'll find out everything I need to know from your friend." No longer surprised by anything, Matthew handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote down a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers on it, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. Barbara left the kitchen and headed for the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the apartment. After taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her former father-in-law's memorized number. But the phone was unavailable. Barbara gathered all her will and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice sounded in the receiver. "Hello. Don't be silent." "Frank, it's me, Barbara." Her voice trembled with excitement. "Barbara, it's good to hear from you." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "My father is abroad, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help you. I am now working in the regional prosecutor's office, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied and told me everything she had learned, dictating the number she had written down. "Okay, Barbara, I get it. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's manageable. I think in the end, for every scumbag, there's a more powerful force. I'll try to help and warn this acquaintance that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out. He'll be able to take the call from his cell phone." "Thank you, Frank." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Barbara ended the conversation and washed her face with ice water, hoping that it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. During her conversation with Frank, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment of his neglect, which had caused her to lose her children, still burned her heart. At the same time, Barbara was well aware that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Roger's family was practically doomed. And she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, Barbara sat in the bathroom, equalizing her breathing with exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Matthew in the kitchen and informed him of what Frank had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Barbara tightly. He saw how exhausted the woman he loved had become in the last hour and didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Barbara had to turn, as Matthew easily guessed, to the man who had nearly destroyed her destiny to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Matthew's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, not paying attention to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the trash. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop the fuss. It's been a hard day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to the peaceful breathing of her sleeping husband, Barbara could not calm down. The images of her little ones came to her mind's eye. They smiled toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and turning to the window, waving their little hands at her. They give her Mother's Day cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they clap loudly and unanimously when she starts to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there were, so carefully stored somewhere far away in the memory. And so rudely all had been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks. And they still wouldn't listen. But what was the use of being angry now? You can't get the water back. Their father is now the only hope that Roger will soon be able to hug his mother. At least let Frank be able to help this complete stranger to Barbara. "Bab, bab, bab," Roger mumbled, and Barbara slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. Carefully, she adjusted the blanket, which he had almost thrown to the floor. Felt Roger's forehead, frightened that the child had spiked a fever, and breathing a sigh of relief, sensing that, from her experience, all was well. Roger opened his eyes and Barbara sat down on the edge of the couch and hummed softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She wanted the child to return to his parents as soon as possible, and at the same time she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Barbara went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her papers, because there was no point in going to bed. In these lucid hours, maybe somewhere far away, were already deciding issues directly related to the fate of Roger. But Barbara was powerless to influence anything. She had already done all that she could, overcoming her resentment. And now all that remained was to wait for the result. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins, wrote out her suggestions on a separate sheet of paper, and carefully tucking everything away in a zippered folder, began, trying not to make any noise, to prepare breakfast. She had already decided to ask Audrey's boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy out too much by moving around unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Barbara typed to Audrey that she would send the prepared documents through her husband. She began to think about what she could do to please the little guest, who of course was worried about being separated from his parents, although he was trying to be a good boy. When Matthew, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Barbara had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Matthew, stop by on your way to Jack's and give him the file for me." I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days. And if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or have it forwarded through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll come over. But I don't want to stress Roger out. I was going to take him to Audrey's mom's and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center. Why does he have to play on the computer all the time? Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Let him have fun. Keep his mind off the sad stuff. He was having nightmares at night. Matthew agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and began to get ready for work. Roger woke up much later, but Barbara didn't think to wake him up. She wanted the boy to feel no discomfort. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a while and then we'll go somewhere to rest." Barbara received a text message on her phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been deposited. Matthew made sure his wife didn't have any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not far from the city, and there are many different options for a fun vacation, a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment? Or maybe you prefer a movie? That's no problem either. I haven't seen a movie on the big screen in a long time." Roger confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest. So that's where we'll head." Audrey was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant that Barbara believed her husband and didn't go out of her way to demand that the child be placed somewhere because of her traumas and memories. She could see that Barbara seemed desperate even after her brief interaction with Roger and barely got them to leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I feel just fine today. Go have fun. I'll call you if there's anything, of course. In fact, don't worry about it. Really, I have more energy today." After yesterday's walk, Audrey turned to the boy and asked Roger, "I beg you, rest well for you and for me." The boy nodded gravely and promised, "I'll have Barbara take pictures and send them to you. You have an advanced smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. That's a great idea. I'm sure I'll have fun with you." Barbara checked. "Do you have a charged cell phone?" Barbara reassured her mother, saying she could recharge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Audrey, and she, left alone, began to dream that her daughter would finally decide to be a mom again. It was obvious to the woman that Barbara could perfectly find a common language with children. She had suffered for so many years, purposely avoiding contact with them. "Let everything turn out well for the injured girl," Audrey pleaded, hoping aloud that the plea would be heard somewhere upstairs. Barbara, driving with particular care, was taking Roger for fun and felt the weight of the responsibility she had voluntarily taken on. The boy had first of all asked to go on the rope course, and the woman had agreed. She wanted to grab the child in her arms and hold him in her arms. Barbara watched the boy and took photos from time to time, but she didn't dare to distract herself from sending especially expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to the woman that if she took her eyes off the boy for even a few seconds, something bad would happen. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Roger's mom was in if she agreed to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Barbara, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman, together with her husband, had gotten involved in a story from which she could not get out on her own. Barbara, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Erin, Roger's mother, knew even less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Matthew and Barbara chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Roger had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then go to the movies. Or vice versa, whichever Roger wants. If you can join us, it'll be fun. He's so funny, and sometimes he has such deep thoughts. He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose so that they'll be afraid and no one will bother them. Can you believe that?" The man agreed that there was something reasonable in that conclusion. "And I suggest, Barbara, let's go to bed like Roger. because tomorrow I expect it's going to be just as busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought word from Frank or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all sorts of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood grew worse every day. He became more and more reflective and sad. Matthew and Barbara realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but they could not influence the situation. Only on Thursday, when Barbara and Roger were visiting Audrey, the long-awaited call came. Frank informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned, "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's minor. The main thing is that the boy is no longer in danger. His parents have already left in the direction of the city where you now live. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive, and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll take this case to the final point, of course. Don't worry." Barbara thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Frank, and forgive me for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Barbara, you don't know how glad I am to hear from you, even if it's for such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll always be glad to help you." Barbara said goodbye to her ex-husband. Audrey, hearing her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seems that her Barbara quite adequately just communicated with a man whom she had once loved and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Roger's parents are already on the road, and I still need to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room, shouting yay. Barbara barely managed to keep him quiet. Audrey, happy that the situation had been resolved safely, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph and a collection of stamps, which he liked so much. "Here you go, Roger. You'll look at the album and remember." "I won't forget me, Grandma Audrey, even without stamps," the child promised. Seizing the moment, Barbara called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Barbara, Hugh told me that your help has solved everything. I'm taking a cab home now to get ready for the party." Barbara was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyous days with her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy store on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently embarrassed, did not walk for a long time between the racks with toys on display. And very soon he took from the shelf not the most expensive robot. On the way to the checkout, Barbara put in the basket an airplane, which Roger had once told her admiringly, and some more board games. "Oh, so many things," marveled the child. "What a celebration today." "Yes, Roger, it's a very big party today," Barbara agreed. By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly ransomed and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Erin, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Barbara flowers, and Hugh gave Matthew a firm, manly hug. After Roger, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the apartment, everyone sat down to eat. Erin volunteered to help Barbara and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have gotten through this. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to offset the cost of Roger and your inconvenience." Barbara turned pale and replied, "Erin, put that envelope away at once. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. If it's not too much trouble, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best thanks." Outraged, Erin burst into tears and hugged Barbara. When Roger, disturbed by his mother and Barbara's long absence from the table, looked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you get bumped, cut, burned?" Barbara and Erin wiped away their tears synchronously. "It's okay, sweetie, and everything is just fine," the mom reassured her son. Putting her arms around the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up and surrounded him. Barbara watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all the turmoil in the past. After the guests had departed, Barbara trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confided to him, "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Roger proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Barbara pleased him and Audrey with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Sharon in honor of Matthew's army friend, and as a symbol of victory over the terrible memories of the past.